Chapter 727. At a glance, Su Chan saw that her master had appeared in the field. She was shocked and couldn't help but let out a low cry. Li Yundong, who was beside her, quickly covered Su Chan's mouth gently, lest her voice be a little louder and scare the two of them away. At this time, Li Yundong's gossipy soul was burning. He was looking forward to the scene of this lonely man and woman meeting for 10 years. Su Chan held Li Yundong's big hand tightly with both hands and looked at Wang Yuanshan and Ao Wushuang without blinking. She was looking forward to the two of them getting back together, because in her impression, her master had never shown a really happy smile. Sometimes, even if she smiled at her, it was a kind of love and doting. She could still see the deep bitterness and loneliness in the depths of her eyes. If only Master could get back together with Grandmaster. The little girl murmured unconsciously in a low voice. Although she had complained that Wang Yuanshan had not left any news for Ao Wushuang in the past 10 years, she still subconsciously hoped that her master could be happy. At this time, Ao Wushuang looked at Wang Yuanshan with an extremely complicated expression. There was ecstasy, shock, resentment, anger, tenderness, and infatuation in her eyes. Li Yundong and Su Chan, who were watching from a distance, couldn't imagine how a person's expression could show such complicated emotions in an instant. For a moment, the empty side peak was extremely quiet. Wang Yuanshan and Ao Wushuang looked at each other quietly. No one spoke, only the wind on the top of the mountain whimpered, and it was silent. After a long time, Ao Wushuang said in a trembling voice, "Don't you want to say something?" Wang Yuanshan looked at Ao Wushuang quietly. After a moment of silence, he sighed softly and said, "Your stealth and hiding skills are still so powerful. I didn't notice your existence at all." Ao Wushuang smiled sadly. "It's been 10 years. Is that all you want to say to me?" Wang Yuanshan said slowly, "Yes, 10 years. 10 years have passed in the blink of an eye, but I feel like only a few days have passed." Tears kept rolling in Ao Wushuang's eyes. This strong, conceited, and arrogant woman was no different from an ordinary woman. Ao Wushuang said in a trembling voice, "But for me, every day is as long as a year. Do you know what it feels like to live like a year? Since you've been alive for the past 10 years, why didn't you come looking for me? With your strength, is there any place in the world that can imprison you?" Wang Yuanshan raised his head and sighed softly. "Wushuang, the world is a big cage. Even if I get out, I will just be jumping from one cage to another. What's the difference?" Ao Wushuang trembled with excitement and shouted, "There's a difference. I'm not in your confinement." Wang Yuanshan lowered his head and looked at Ao Wushuang with gentle eyes. He said softly, "Wushuang, look at your childish words. Aren't you and I in this world? We are all trapped in this cage, so we should be thinking about how to get out of this cage instead of being obsessed with this cage." Ao Wushuang couldn't believe her ears and eyes. This man whom she had held onto a glimmer of hope and waited bitterly for 10 years, was he really Wang Yuanshan? How could he say such a thing? Ao Wushuang finally couldn't hold back her tears. They dripped down like pearls from a broken necklace. She sobbed and said, "Wang Yuanshan, have you forgotten everything? Have you forgotten what you once said to me? Don't tell me you've forgotten your oath? Have you forgotten that you will stay with me until the end of time?" Wang Yuanshan was silent for a while, then he smiled softly and said, "Wushuang, the Wang Yuanshan you know is dead. He died when he was caught 10 years ago. Forget him. The one standing in front of you now is not Wang Yuanshan." After that, he sighed softly, turned around and walked down the mountain. Ao Wushuang had never expected that she would get such an answer after waiting for 10 years. She only felt that her heart had been crushed into powder in an instant. She cried so hard that she could hardly stand. Su Chan couldn't bear it anymore. At this time, Su Chan couldn't help it anymore. She rushed down the mountain and hugged Ao Wushuang. While crying, she said, "Master, don't cry, don't cry. This heartless man is not worth your tears." Ao Wushuang grabbed Su Chan at once, threw her head into her arms and began to cry like a child. The sound of her crying was so miserable that it really made people feel sad. But Wang Yuanshan seemed to have a heart of stone. He didn't look back in the midst of the crying and slowly walked down the mountain. Su Chan looked at his figure with tears in her eyes and couldn't help shouting, "Wang Yuanshan, you are ungrateful. I hate you." Wang Yuanshan paused slightly, but then he continued to walk forward. After a few steps, his figure disappeared in an instant. Li Jiandong watched this scene silently from the cliff. His burning desire for gossip had long since disappeared. At this time, his heart was extremely heavy. For a moment he didn't know what to say or do. He couldn't help thinking of the lyrics of 10 years. 10 years ago I didn't know you. You didn't belong to me. We were still the same. We accompanied a stranger and walked through the streets that we gradually became familiar with. 10 years later we are friends and can greet each other. But that kind of gentleness can no longer be found a reason to hug. In the end, lovers inevitably become friends. The melody of this song rang uncontrollably in Li Jiandong's mind. He couldn't help but think, will Su Chan and I become like this in the future? As soon as this thought flashed through his mind, Li Jiandong clenched his fists fiercely. No, absolutely not. No one can separate me from her. Thinking of this, Li Jiandong couldn't help but jump to the top of the mountain. He came to Su Chan's side, gently pressed his hand on her shoulder and said softly, "Get up. Let's go back." At this time Ao Wushuang was devastated and cried so hard that she fainted in Su Chan's arms. The little girl wiped her tears and stood up with her master in her arms. She sobbed and said, "Yundong, I'm so sad." Li Jiandong stretched out his hand lovingly and wiped away the tears on Su Chan's face. He comforted her softly, "Maybe Wang Yuanshan has his own difficulties?" Su Chan's eyes lit up and she suddenly said in a hurry, "Yes, there must be some difficulties. Yundong, don't you think so? It must be like this. Master must have made a mistake, right?" When Li Jiandong said this, he didn't believe it himself. In his opinion, was there anything more important than being with the person he loved? Difficulties? Even if the sky fell down, the two of them would die together. *CK the difficulties. But these words could only be said in his heart. At the moment he could persuade her as long as he could. Even if she knew that he was lying to her, with Su Chan's intelligence, it was impossible for her not to know that Li Jiandong was lying to her. But the little girl would rather be fooled and then comfort her master with it. Li Yundong smiled gently, nodded in self-deception and said, "Well, he must have his reasons. Let's ask him again later. But, in my opinion, if Wang Yuanshan doesn't want to say it himself, I'm afraid it's useless no matter who asks." Su Chan felt much better. She hugged Ao Wushuang and said, "Yundong, let's go back. I don't want to stay here. I don't like it here." Li Jiandong nodded and said, "Well, let's go." The two of them took the unconscious Ao Wushuang all the way back. After leaving Mount Longhu, they flew to Tianan City. By the time they got home, it was already late at night. After Su Chan put Ao Wushuang on the bed, she sat by the bed and looked at her master quietly. She had never seen her master have such a weak side, which made her feel so sad as if someone had pinched her with their hands. Li Jiandong accompanied her by her side. After a long time, Su Chan turned around and said softly to Li Jiandong, "Yundong, I'll sit with master for a while. Speaking of which, it seems that I've never been with her quietly for a night. Let me be alone with her, okay?" Li Jiandong nodded, kissed the little girl's forehead gently and said softly, "Well, don't hurt your body. I'll go back first." As he said this, Li Jiandong walked to the door and suddenly turned around. He said gently, "Chaner, don't worry. No matter what happens in the future, I won't leave you. I'm not Wang Yuanshan." Su Chan turned her head and looked at Li Jiandong in a daze. Somehow tears flowed down her cheeks. She smiled, wiped her tears and nodded hard. Li Jiandong nodded and smiled at Su Chan lovingly, then went out the door. After going out, Li Jiandong raised his head and sighed. Just as he was about to go to his room, he saw Ziyuan looking at him with sparkling eyes in the corridor. She asked curiously, "What's wrong with you? Why do you look like you're going to be separated forever? I seem to have heard you mention my master's name just now." Li Jiandong suddenly hesitated. He didn't know whether he should tell Ziyuan about Wang Yuanshan or not. If she knew that Wang Yuanshan was not dead, he really didn't know what kind of thoughts she would have. But what kind of person was Ziyuan? She was one of the most intelligent women in the world. Under her observation, she thought for a moment, and then her breathing immediately became rapid. Her eyes widened and her voice trembled slightly. "Do you have news about my master? Is he really not dead?" Li Jiandong sighed and said, "Yes, I went to Mount Longhu with Su Chan before and happened to meet the overseas forces of Jingyi School. The people of Jingyi School were forced to do nothing, so Zhang Kongyun forced Wang Yuanshan out." Hearing this, Ziyuan's body swayed slightly. Li Jiandong immediately took a step forward, held her with both hands and asked softly, "Are you all right?" Ziyuan seemed to be in a trance. She calmed down, forced a smile at Li Jiandong and said, I'm fine. Let me be alone for a while." As she said this, she staggered back to her room. Ziyuan entered the opposite door and went to her room. After closing the door, she leaned her back against the door as if she had lost all her strength. Her body slowly slid down. Unknowingly, her eyes were already full of tears. "Master, You really didn't die? If you didn't die, why did you abandon us back then? Ziyuan covered her mouth with one hand and sobbed silently. But Ziyuan was Ziyuan after all. She was different from Ao Wushuang, who was cold on the outside but warm on the inside. Ao Wushuang's emotions, which had accumulated for 10 years, burst out like a volcanic eruption, and she cried until she fainted. However, Ziyuan silently shed tears for a while, then wiped her tears and stood up gracefully. Ziyuan was a gentle person. When she suddenly learned of Wang Yuanshan's whereabouts, she only had questions in her heart, but there was no resentment or doubt. Her eyes were blurred and she whispered to herself, "Master, do you know? The psalms you once told me have almost all come true now. But when I completely believe what you have to say, I know that you are not dead. What do you want me to do?" For a moment, Ziyuan couldn't help but think of her master's figure in the past. Those scenes flashed before her eyes like a horse lantern. Every day she spent with her master was as ordinary as a clear stream in the mountains, like a breeze in the jungle. But after these scenes she had received the news that Ruan Hongling, the successor of Jindan's stage, had appeared in the Taoist temple. From the beginning she had met Li Yunyang, witnessed him being struck by lightning, and taught him cultivation step by step. Then she had been willing to destroy 2 magic treasures for him to survive the divine tribulation. The two of them got along with each other bit by bit. There were memories of earth-shattering battles, family trifles, and warm memories of the two of them sitting side by side in the kitchen. They were like mountains, rivers, and rivers. There were times when they were calm and low, and there were also ups and downs. Unconsciously, Ziyuan sat down in front of the desk, picked up the inkstone on the inkstone in front of the desk and gently ground the ink. Then she gently picked up the brush on the brush rack, dipped it in the ink and unconsciously wrote their names on the paper in front of her. At first, Ziyuan was still writing Wang Yuanshan and Li Yunyang in turn, but then when Ziyuan had unconsciously written the whole page she suddenly came to her senses. At a glance she saw that Wang Yuanshan's name had only appeared a few times at the beginning, and then the rest of the paper was full of Li Yunyang's name. Looking at this piece of paper, Ziyuan was lost in thought for a moment. Her eyes were blurred and she was actually crazy. Chapter 728. Ziyuan faintly looked at the note she had written and was a little obsessed. Just as she was in a daze there was a sudden knock on the door. Soon. The sudden knock on the door awakened Ziyuan. She hurriedly crumpled the paper full of words into a ball. Then, she watched as the ball of paper suddenly spontaneously ignited in her hand. After burning it to ashes and throwing it into the trash can, she felt relieved. She walked to the door and gently opened it. Ziyuan looked at the door nervously, only to see that the person standing at the door was not the man who had made her heart beat wildly, but her shimmy Ruan Hongling. Ruan Hongling looked at her Shiji strangely. She had rarely seen her Shiji panic and carefully hide her expression. She looked into the room curiously, then frowned and fanned herself with her hands. "Is there a fire in your room?" Ziyuan calmed down and gradually recovered from her panic. She asked lightly, "What's the matter?" Although Ruan Hongling felt strange, she did not suspect anything. She entered Ziyuan's room and opened the window to ventilate the room. Then, she sat casually on the edge of the bed and looked at her toes, as if hesitating whether to say what she wanted to say. Seeing her like this, Ziyuan smiled and said, "Did you come to my room so late to study the size of your feet?" Ruan Hongling raised her head and suddenly said quickly, "Shiji Ziyuan, we can't go on like this." Ziyuan asked curiously, "How?" Ruan Hongling said with red eyes, "I mean we are being bullied. You have to find a way to repair the 2 great treasures of our Jingyi school. Otherwise we will lose the position of the head of Linggong sect sooner or later." Ziyuan didn't speak. She lowered her head in silence. After a while she raised her head and said, "You should know, the difficulty of repairing these 2 powerful magical treasures is no different from rebuilding them. It's too difficult and takes too much time. It's impossible." Ruan Hongling said anxiously, "But we should try." "Yes, I know it's too difficult, but Shiji, I really can't stand the feeling of being humiliated in front of everyone. If the Japanese hadn't come to mess things up this time, and if Li Yundong hadn't driven the Japanese away with great power, can you imagine what the situation would have been like?" Ziyuan naturally knew that her outcome and fate would be very terrible. A young woman like her would be imprisoned and face the wall. From then on she would have to face the green lamp and the withered wall, ending her life. Ziyuan was not afraid of loneliness and solitude. She was originally a woman with a light temperament and was not involved in the affairs of the world. If facing the wall and being imprisoned could eventually help her achieve the Tao and ascend to become an immortal, she could even stay at home for the rest of her life and never leave that small Taoist temple. But now there was still a trace of reluctance in her heart. She was still thinking about the psalm that her master had left for her. This psalm was her life's destiny that her master had left for her. She had already uncovered most of it, but there were still some parts that she had yet to uncover. At the very least, she wanted to know the final answer and outcome before she faced all of this. Then she would have no regrets. Moreover, behind this idea, there was a faint trace of reluctance. She was already somewhat used to such a life. If she suddenly left this place, would she be reluctant to leave? Would she regret it? Would she be sad? Would she be reluctant to do so? She didn't know. Deep in her heart, Ziyuan didn't even want to think about this question. Sometimes she was strong and calm, but sometimes even if she knew that she would be hurt, she would be like an ostrich, unwilling to face these problems. Looking at the silent Ziyuan, Ruan Hongling became more and more anxious, and her voice became louder. Shiji, master doesn't care about us, but don't you care? At this time, Ziyuan suddenly raised her head and looked at Ruan Hongling with a complicated look in her eyes. She interrupted her softly, Hongling master, he's not dead. Ruan Hongling's voice stopped abruptly, and the expression on her face froze. After a long time, her anxiety turned to shock and then from shock to anger. She felt that she had been deceived, and a wave of anger rushed to the top of her head. Master is not dead? Then why hasn't he cared about us for the past 10 years? Then why would he rather watch us being bullied than come out to help us? The more Ruan Hongling spoke, the angrier she became. Her chest rose and fell violently as she shouted, how could he do this? It's fine if he left us alone for 10 years, but how could he watch his own sect be bullied like this? What kind of master is he? Ziyuan sighed softly and said, Hongling, master must have his own difficulties. Don't talk about it. At least we know that master is still alive. This is good news, isn't it? Ruan Hongling's eyes were red, and her voice trembled slightly. Good news? For me, the good news now is that we need to repair those two powerful magical weapons as soon as possible. Ziyuan didn't speak again. She shook her head and said, don't think about it. It's too difficult. Ruan Hongling stared at Ziyuan unwillingly. After a while, she stamped her feet and rushed out of the room. Soon. Ziyuan looked at Ruan Hongling's figure and opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something. However, she quickly swallowed her words and sighed faintly. She sat quietly in the room alone, letting the cold moonlight shine on her body, projecting a lonely figure beside the bed. It wasn't until the next day that the jade rabbit quietly left the sky and the golden crow rose from the sky again. Ziyuan was shocked to realize that the next day had already arrived. Ziyuan was slightly shocked. She felt that the warm sunlight was warming her body. She stood up gently and walked out of the door to prepare breakfast. However, early in the morning she saw Ruan Hongling rushing to the opposite door angrily. Ziyuan opened her mouth and shouted, but Ruan Hongling rushed out without looking back. She sighed and shook her head. At this time Ruan Hongling rushed to Li Yundong's room angrily. She couldn't stand her Shiji's sometimes gentle personality. She wanted to ask Li Yundong for help and explain this matter to him. In order to help you get through the heavenly tribulation, Ziyuan broke the glass mirror and the purple gold luo jade plate. Do you know that? Even if you didn't know, now that you know, don't you think you should do something? Do you know how badly Shiji was bullied before? These words echoed in Ruan Hongling's mind all night. She had been hesitating whether she should go to her master or Li Yundong. But after thinking about it, Ruan Hongling finally chose Li Yundong, who was chivalrous and kept his promise, instead of the master who had a closer relationship with her but had left them alone for 10 years. Ruan Hongling also had the key to Li Yundong's door. She opened the door roughly and rushed in. Her posture and movements made the little foxes who were practicing in the room early in the morning turn their heads to look at her in surprise. Ruan Hongling ignored their gazes and rushed all the way to Li Yundong's room. She broke in without knocking on the door. But as soon as she entered, Ruan Hongling smelled a strong fragrance of medicine. Li Yundong, who was wrapped up like a mummy, was lying quietly on the bed. Ruan Hongling was stunned. Only then did she come to her senses. Li Yundong, who was invincible in the world, was still seriously injured and unconscious. Ruan Hongling's eyes darkened. She bit her lips gently with her snow-white teeth and complained in a low voice, "Aren't you made of iron? Why don't you stand up quickly?" As she was speaking in a low voice, she heard a voice coming from behind her. "Hey, what's the matter?" Ruan Hongling looked back and saw Li Yundong standing behind her, looking at her with a smile. His body was intact and he didn't look injured at all. Ruan Hongling didn't come to her senses for a moment. She was startled and unconsciously exclaimed, which made the little foxes in the living room laugh. But Ruan Hongling quickly reacted. She rolled her eyes at Li Yundong and said angrily, "You're injured. Why don't you be quiet?" Li Yundong cried out, feeling wronged. "Who was the one who wanted me to stand up immediately just now?" Ruan Hongling blushed and argued, "I just think it's a little strange that you've been lying like this all this time. Aren't you always full of energy?" Li Yundong laughed. "Just take it as a vacation. Can't I rest for 2 days?" Ruan Hongling had gotten used to bickering with Li Yundong in the past. For a moment she forgot the purpose of her visit. She blushed and put on a posture as if she wanted to fight with Li Yundong for 300 rounds. However, Li Yundong smiled and said, Okay, stop it. Why are you looking for me?" Ruan Hongling opened her mouth, but she hesitated. She stared at Li Yundong carefully. Just as she was about to speak, she heard a cell phone vibrating on the desk in Li Yundong's room. Li Yundong showed an apologetic expression to Ruan Hongling. He picked up the phone and glanced at it, only to see that it was a call from Lu Feier. As soon as Li Yundong picked up the phone, Lu Feier's clear voice came through. "Thank God. I thought you had disappeared again. Hey, where are you now?" Li Yundong chuckled. "Me? I'm back in Tianan City." Lu Feier said angrily, "You're so annoying. You didn't even say goodbye before you left. It took us a long time to find you. I thought something had happened to you. You didn't answer the phone before." Li Yundong smiled and said, "There was something urgent, so I left in a hurry. By the way, how's the crew? Where's President Chow? Is she okay?" Lu Feier's voice suddenly changed and she said very seriously, "Do you still remember Sister Chow? Li Yundong, I tell you you're in trouble, big trouble." Li Yundong was stunned and his heart trembled slightly. He thought to himself, could something have happened to Chow Kefi? No way. Chapter 729. Li Yundong's voice suddenly became low. He glanced at Ruan Hongling and showed an apologetic expression. Then he walked to the side and asked in a low voice, "What happened?" Lu Feier sighed and her voice suddenly became very helpless. "You'll know when you come." Li Yundong frowned. "Is it urgent?" Lu Feier said, "It's very urgent. It's best if you can come in the next second." Li Yundong's heart tightened. He nodded and said, "Then I'll be there as soon as possible." Bubble. Book. After putting down the phone, Li Yundong said to Ruan Hongling, "Hongling, I have something urgent to do. I'll go out for a while." Ruan Hongling sighed and saw that Li Yundong had disappeared in the blink of an eye. She was so angry that she stamped her feet and said angrily, "You're so annoying. My business is more urgent." As she spoke, she looked indignantly at Li Yundong, who was unconscious on the bed, and made a threatening gesture. If Li Yundong hadn't been seriously injured, she would have punched him already. Ruan Hongling glared at Li Yundong angrily for a long time before she stamped her feet and rushed out of the room. Li Yundong, who was rushing to Hainan, didn't know what was on Ruan Hongling's mind. He flew quickly with his yang spirit body and found a place where no one was around to land. Then he rushed to the Xian Hotel. When he arrived at the door of the hotel, he called Lu Feier and asked, "Where are you now?" Lu Feier's voice was obviously stunned. "You're back? So fast?" Li Yundong said in a low voice, "Well, are you still in the room or in the studio?" Lu Feier hesitated for a moment and said, "We're in the room. Come quickly." Li Yundong hung up the phone without hesitation and rushed to Lu Feier and Chow Kefi's room. He pressed his hand on the doorknob and turned it, only to find that the door was not locked, so he pushed the door open and walked in. As soon as he pushed the door open, Li Yundong heard a pop-pop-pot sound and several black shadows rushed toward him. Li Yundong was shocked. Although he was only at the yang spirit realm at this time, he still had the experience of fighting in his spiritual power. At this time he immediately subconsciously pushed his Jinchi forward, pushing it out like an invisible wall. The black shadows were immediately sent flying back. Buff, buff, buff. The screams of a few women could be heard. At this time, Li Yundong took a closer look and saw more than a dozen people standing in the room. Some were holding firecrackers, some were wearing pointed hats, and some were holding toy trumpets. But no matter what they were holding, they all seemed to be frozen. They were staring in one direction, not at Li Yundong but at the two women in front of him. Of the two girls, one of them had a cream cake covering her face. Her face couldn't be seen, and the cream cake obviously couldn't hold on any longer. It slowly slid down her face, revealing a sluggish face. Her eyes looked as if she had just been raped by 100 burly men, full of grievance and resentment. Li Yundong's eyes widened. For a moment he couldn't recognize who the woman with the cream cake on her face was. But when he looked to the side he was shocked. The other woman was none other than Chow Kefi. At this time, Chow Kefi's chest was covered with a strawberry chocolate cake. Her towering breasts provided a good angle for the cake. The cake did not slide down for a while, but the strawberries on it kept sliding down the ravine of her chest endlessly. Li Yundong was dumbfounded and stammered, What's going on?" He turned his head and glanced at the other people in the room, only to see that the other members of the crew were in the room. Some were actors, some were stage managers, and Chris was among them. She was also wearing a clown hat and holding a firecracker in her hand. Her head was very low, but Li Yundong could tell from her shrugging shoulders that she was having a hard time holding back her laughter. Li Yundong glanced around but no one answered him. Everyone seemed to be under a spell of silence. Li Yundong raised his voice. "No one can tell me what's going on here?" Seeing his surprised look, Lu Feier was so aggrieved that she almost cried. She quickly wiped her face with her hand and said angrily, "Hey, it seems that I should be the one shouting, right?" Li Yundong glanced at her, only to see that this popular idol was like a snowman with a face full of cream. She looked ridiculous. He couldn't help laughing out loud. "Did you call me here in a hurry just to ask me to dress you up? Not bad, your fans will like your new look." Lu Feier was seething with anger. She quickly grabbed the cream on her face and flung it at Li Yundong. "You bastard! You're pissing me off. Don't you know how to be kind to a woman?" Lu Feier said. Seeing that she was throwing the cream at him, Li Yundong immediately changed his yang spirit to yin spirit, and the cream passed through his body. He chuckled and said, "It's your own fault. Why did you lie to me? Look, now the retribution is coming, isn't it?" When Lu Feier saw that the cream she had thrown had passed through Li Yundong's body, she suddenly widened her eyes. Her dark eyes looked even more ridiculous on a face full of cream. But after staring for a while, tears suddenly welled up in her eyes. After a while she quickly wiped her tears with both hands. When Li Yundong saw the girl crying he felt a headache coming on. He looked at Chow Kefi who was beside him as if asking for help. He saw that Chow Kefi was wiping the cream on her chest with a handkerchief. When she saw him looking at her, she rolled her eyes. Li Yundong saw that when she was wiping the cream, her chest was surging, which was really magnificent. He secretly took a breath of cold air and didn't dare to look at her anymore. He turned to Lu Feier and said with a wry smile, "Hey, no way. You're crying now? I haven't cried yet. I came here in a hurry. I didn't expect that you would arrange a sneak attack. Fortunately, I reacted quickly. Otherwise, he." Li Yundong didn't say the following words. Otherwise, if the news that Invincible Li, who had defeated the Japanese cultivation world with his own strength and was known as the Fighting Heavenly Master, had been smashed beyond recognition by 2 pieces of cake got out, he was afraid that it would become the biggest joke in the Chinese cultivation world. Those Japanese people would be so angry that they would commit suicide the next day. Thinking of this, a thought suddenly flashed through Li Yundong's mind. What will those Japanese do when they go back? Will they be willing? Will they keep their promise? But he quickly chased this thought out of his mind. He waved at Chris, who was not far away and kept snickering with her head down. "Hey Chris, can you explain to me how all this happened?" Chris asked, "Can you explain to me how all this happened?" Chris raised her head and looked at Li Yundong timidly, then at Lu Feier and Chow Kefi, who were embarrassed. She couldn't help but burst into laughter, but she immediately stopped laughing. She came to Li Yundong's side with a straight face, coughed dryly and said, "Master, today is Sister Chow's birthday, so we want to celebrate, but you are not here, so Lu Feier suggested." Lu Feier didn't wait for her to finish and immediately said loudly, "Hey, you proposed to hit him with a cake." Chris's face changed greatly. She quickly waved her hands and said, No, it wasn't me, I didn't." Lu Feier said angrily, "You were the one who suggested it. You said that it was popular in your country." Chris looked at Li Yundong with a terrified face. Like a child who had done something bad, she lowered her head and murmured, I just said it casually. The decision is up to you." Lu Feier pounced on Chris with her creamy hands and tried hard to wipe Chris's face. "You are the initiator, the accomplice, and the main culprit. You can't escape the punishment of the law." At this time, Chris had completely forgotten that she had also inhaled the divine aura of elixir. Her physique had long surpassed that of ordinary people by dozens of times. This blonde foreign girl was obviously living a good life in the crew. She screamed and played hide-and-seek with Lu Feier in the room. Watching from the side, Li Yundong felt both warm and funny. He couldn't help but think of what he had encountered before. The continuous fierce battles in Mount Longhu seemed to be very far away from him at this time. At this time, the heaviness brought to him by Wang Yuanshan and Ao Wushuang's 10 years of acquaintance also slowly drifted away. He looked at the frolicking Chris and Lu Feier with a smile. He glanced to the side and saw that Chow Kefi was wiping her chest while looking at the two of them with a smile. Her eyes were soft and warm as if she enjoyed such a life very much. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat and he thought to himself, Chow Kefi doesn't seem to be completely controlled by the mystical silver fox, but this day will come sooner or later. What should I think of to help her keep her soul? Chow Kefi seemed to notice Li Yundong's gaze. She looked up at him and her cheeks immediately turned red. Li Yundong saw that such a beautiful woman was so shy that she lowered her head. It was really beautiful. He immediately withdrew his gaze, coughed dryly and said seriously, Sister Chow, happy birthday? Chow Kefi calmed herself down. She raised her head and said with a smile, do you have any birthday present to prepare? Li Yundong came in a hurry, so how could he have any birthday present? He thought for a moment and said with a wry smile, is a happy birthday enough? Chow Kefi stared at Li Yundong with infatuation in her eyes. She smiled softly and said, yes, this is the best birthday present I have ever received. As soon as she finished speaking, Lu Feier shouted exaggeratedly, Sister Chow, it's not fair. I gave you such a valuable gift but you didn't even say that to me. I said happy birthday without any capital, and your bones became a little lighter. You don't value love more than friends, do you? I protest, I complain, I want to go to the crew to impeach you. Most of the people in the crew knew about the scandal between Chow Kefi and Li Yundong and they all laughed. Chow Kefi's face turned red from the laughter. She flew into a rage out of shame and pounced on Lu Feier, scratching and scratching. I'll let you say it, I'll let you say it. For a moment, there was constant laughter in the room. Li Yundong saw two beautiful women, one big and one small, shouting and rolling together. They were really fat and thin, lively and fragrant. Li Yundong looked at Chow Kefi who was playing with Lu Feier, and suddenly said with emotion in his heart, Sister Chow, if I help you keep your soul and memory, what do you think of this birthday present? As soon as this thought flashed through his mind, Li Yundong unconsciously smiled bitterly. It's really difficult to fight with the mystical silver fox for the body and soul. Chapter 730. Although a sudden birthday party had tricked Li Yundong from Tianan City to Haikao City, Li Yundong still stayed with the mentality of taking things as they came. He smiled and watched the crew celebrate Chow Kefi's birthday together. As the birthday girl, Chow Kefi wore a pointy hat in the crowd. There were still some cream cake stains on her face and body, but this still could not hide her amazing beauty. This coquettish woman smiled like a flower in the crowd. Even a blind man would be able to see again after seeing her. His eyes lit up. The party lasted for more than an hour in the room before everyone calmed down a little. Some went to the spacious room to drink and have fun at the bar, while others gathered on the balcony to smoke and chat. Li Yundong stood alone in the corner with his back against the wall, quietly lost in thought. Suddenly, a woman's voice came from beside him. What are you doing here? Don't you drink? Li Yundong turned his head and saw that Chow Kefi had changed into a new set of clothes. The cake stains on her head and chest had long been washed away. At this time she was wearing a red cheongsam. Her slender snow-white legs were faintly discernible from the opening of the cheongsam. Her black hair was coiled high behind her head, revealing her full and bright forehead and slender snow-white neck. She looked like a proud and noble lady. Chow Kefi was holding two transparent goblets in her hands. Each goblet was filled with a third of red wine. It was crystal clear like liquid gems and flowing agate. Chow Kefi had obviously drunk a little too much. She looked at Li Yundong with blurred eyes, and the corners of her mouth were gently pursed, forming a playful smile. Li Yundong looked at the wine in her hand, smiled slightly and shook his head. I won't drink. Drinking alcohol is harmful to the liver. I advise you not to drink either. Chow Kefi giggled. She was obviously having a good time today. Her eyes were full of autumn waves as she smiled and said, life is full of joy. Don't let the wine cup be empty to the moon. When I met you a few months ago you were still a wine fairy. Now you actually say that you don't drink anymore. TSK, you are not honest. Li Yundong smiled and said, I had no choice. I had to drink at that time. Chow Kefi giggled and said, yeah, you're quite protective of the fairer sex. I haven't thanked you properly last time. Maybe it was the alcohol that gave her courage. Chow Kefi leaned over to Li Yundong a little drunk and giggled. Hey, how can I thank you? You've helped me so much? Li Yundong quietly moved a little and said, Sister Chow, didn't you help me a lot? Aren't we friends? It's only natural. Li Yundong was standing next to a counter, just 2 fists away from it. As soon as he moved aside, he made room for a person. Chow Kefi thought that Li Yundong was making room for her, so she immediately stepped forward and got in. As the saying goes, beer goes to the belly, white wine goes to the head, and red wine goes to the legs. When Chow Kefi took a step forward, her body suddenly staggered as if she was about to fall. Li Yundong didn't expect that Chow Kefi would take advantage of the situation. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had to hold Chow Kefi with both hands and persuade her, Sister Chow, you drank too much. Chow Kefi giggled and said, I didn't drink too much. You drank too much. By the way, you won't get drunk no matter how much you drink. I can't compare to you. Li Yundong supported Chow Kefi and said softly, Sister Chow, let me take you back. Chow Kefi giggled and said, Go back? This is my room. Where should I go? Li Yundong saw that she was swaying as if she would fall into his arms if he let go, so he said, I'll take you to my room to have a rest. Chow Kefi looked at Li Yundong with her charming eyes and giggled. Go to your room? Well, help me there. I'm going to drink with you all night. Li Yundong smiled bitterly and turned to look at the other people in the room. He saw that Lu Feier was chatting with Chris, but she glanced at him from time to time. Especially when she saw him supporting Chow Kefi, her eyes became more and more ambiguous and strange. In front of Li Yundong, there was a charming beauty who threw herself into his arms. It would be a lie if he didn't feel any emotions in his heart. People were not plants and trees. How could they be emotionless? Li Yundong was not a piece of wood. How could he not know what Chow Kefi meant to him? Moreover, in the past, Master Huifa, with his high cultivation, had almost set himself on fire in the face of the seduction of the mystical silver fox, let alone a strong Yuanyang boy like him. Li Yundong sighed in his heart and didn't dare to stay any longer. He supported Chow Kefi and walked to his room. Chow Kefi giggled as she walked. After entering the room, Chow Kefi gently struggled out of Li Yundong's hands and fell onto the bed. She giggled and said, I'm so happy today. I didn't expect you to really come. I thought you wouldn't come today. Li Yundong smiled and didn't answer her. He just took off her high heels and carried her to the bed. After washing a hot towel in the bathroom and wiping her face for her, he said softly, Sister Chow, sleep for a while. I'll go over first. Just as he was about to leave, Chow Kefi grabbed his hand and said with a pleading face, Don't go. Talk to me. It'll be okay in a while. Li Yundong hesitated for a moment, nodded, and sat by the bed. When Chow Kefi saw him sitting down, she immediately breathed a sigh of relief, as if she felt safer and calmer with this man by her side. She murmured in a low voice, You don't know. I've been exhausted these days. It's hard for me to have such a rest today. I haven't been so happy for a long time. You know, it's really tiring for a person like me to stay in this circle and refuse to be followed by others. When a man sees me, he thinks that I'm doing business by selling my body and wants to come up and take advantage of me. When a woman sees me, she thinks that I'm a prostitute, and her eyes are full of contempt. Chow Kefi let out a long sigh, and her eyes were full of resentment and grievance. Li Yundong saw it and sighed softly. Then why do you still do this? Chow Kefi raised her eyes slightly and smiled bitterly. Then what do I do? Which line of work will I not be misunderstood by others? Unless I'm really a prostitute. Chow Kefi exhaled softly, and her breath was as fragrant as orchids. At first, I just wanted to prove that I was not worse than others, so I worked hard. But I didn't expect that after such a long time in this line of work, I couldn't extricate myself. I couldn't figure out what else I could do in the future if I quit this line of work. Li Yundong smiled and said, Sister Chow, you are so smart and beautiful. What can't you do? Chow Kefi shook her head and said faintly, Beautiful? It's not a good thing to be too beautiful. Sometimes, a woman is too beautiful, which is a kind of original sin. An ordinary man is innocent, but he will get into trouble because of his wealth. You've seen it before. Even a guy like Zhao Yuzhen wanted to take advantage of me and I was almost killed by him. Fortunately you're here. As she said this, Chow Kefi looked at Li Yundong with blurred eyes and said, Tell me, are you my lucky star? Li Yundong didn't say anything and smiled silently. At this moment, anything he said would be wrong. 1,000 words were not as good as a silence. Chow Kefi looked at Li Yundong faintly as if she knew what he was thinking. She sighed and envied the girl named Su Chan in her heart. She also felt a little resentful at Li Yundong's unromantic avoidance, but more than that she admired Li Yundong's persistence. The women around Li Yundong were very strange. The more infatuated he was with Su Chan, the more they admired him. The more they admired him, the more they loved him. It was as if they were stuck in a quagmire and couldn't get out. Well, I won't embarrass you. Just accompany me and listen to what I have to say. Although Fair is a good person, there are some things that can't be said to her. Chow Kefi took Li Yundong's hand and murmured softly like a child. Throughout the night, she kept talking about her past until she fell into a deep sleep. Li Yundong saw that she had closed her eyes and was no longer talking. There was a soft snoring sound coming from her sinuses, and her body was lying on the bed. Because she was lying on her side, a deep ravine was squeezed out of her snow-white chest. This ravine was illuminated by the moonlight outside the window, and the shadows were really clear and layered. The exposed skin was as white as snow and as delicate as jade, enough to bury the lofty aspirations of any hero and martyr in the world. Chow Kefi's delicate red lips were slightly open, and she had a seductive posture that allowed him to taste her. Her eyebrows were filled with a soul-stirring charm. Although there was no gaze or seductive words, just the posture of her jade-like body was like a silent burning raging fire, burning people to the point that they wanted to turn into moths flying into the fire and pounce forward without any regard for their lives. The inferior seduction was nothing more than selling one's body, while the superior seduction was to move one's emotions, supplemented by looming temptation. If Chow Kefi had thrown herself into Li Yundong's arms as soon as she came up and seduced him, he would have left long ago. But she just begged in a low voice, wanting to talk to him. How could a man like Li Yundong, who had tender feelings for the fairer sex, have the heart to refuse? Li Yundong looked at Chow Kefi in front of the bed. He only felt as if there was a fire burning under his abdomen, teasing him. For a moment, his mouth was a little dry and his mind was buzzing. He stretched out his hand slightly as if he wanted to touch Chow Kefi's body, which was as soft as water. At this time, if it had been another man, he would have died under the peony and become a ghost. But Li Yundong quickly calmed down. He took back his frozen hand in midair, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he gently pulled out his other hand from her hand, stood up and slowly walked out. As soon as he went out, Li Yundong saw the door of Chow Kefi's room open. Lu Fair and Chris came out of the room with red faces. Although the two girls were about the same height, one had a black oval face, the other a golden oval face. One face was full of oriental classical charm, and the other was full of exotic charm. When put together they were very eye-catching. Li Yundong could see at a glance that Lu Fair had obviously drunk too much, and her eyes were a little blurred. On the other hand, although Chris's snow-white cheeks were smeared with a trace of shame, her eyes were extremely bright. Li Yundong asked with a smile, "How much did you drink?" Chris opened her mouth and was about to speak, but Lu Fair rushed to say with a smile, "Not much. I drank 2 bottles. Chris is amazing. She drank 4 bottles. No man can compete with her." After drinking 2 bottles of wine, the aftereffects were not small. Lu Fair staggered and couldn't stand still, but she still shouted that she wanted to go out to play. Li Yundong looked at the two of them and thought to himself, "That's not right. According to reason, Chow Kefi should be possessed by the soul of the mystical silver fox now. Her internal organs should be very strong, so she shouldn't be drunk. Could it be that it's not the wine that makes people drunk?" Thinking of this, Li Yundong was silent for a while and sighed softly. In the room, Chow Kefi had also opened her black and bright eyes at this time. Her eyes were clear and there was no sign of drunkenness. She looked at the ceiling quietly as if she wanted to look straight at the sky through the reinforced concrete. After a long time she let out a long sigh. Chow Kefi sat up gracefully and silently looked at the cold crescent moon outside the French window. Her eyes flickered with struggle, pain, infatuation, and confusion. However, these emotions were mixed together. After a long time, they slowly settled down, and another kind of cold gaze appeared in her eyes. The coquettish woman smiled coldly and said, "Wisdom King, good concentration, good concentration. Hey, you escaped with your life." Chapter 731. After that night, Li Yundong did not stay in the crew. He had wanted to say hello to Chow Kefi, Lu Fair, and the others early in the morning before returning to Tianan City. However, because many of them had been crazy too late last night, they were still sleeping when Li Yundong arrived early in the morning. Li Yundong had no choice but to return to Tianan City first. But as soon as he got home, he saw Ling Yu, the little fox, coming up to him with her mobile phone. She said in surprise, Leader, you're back? You called just now." It was very inconvenient for Li Yundong to go out with his yang spirit body, so he had left his phone at home. Hearing Ling Yu's words, he took the phone and asked curiously, "Who's calling?" Ling Yu blinked her eyes. "I don't know. They didn't say anything. They just told you to call her back when you're back. It's a girl." Li Yundong smiled at her and asked, "Where's Su-chan? Still in the room? Your young martial uncle hasn't woken up yet?" Ling Yu shook her head. "No, Su-chan hasn't come out of her room yet." Li Yundong nodded and said to her with a smile, "Okay, I got it. Go and do your work." After watching Ling Yu leave, he turned on his phone and saw a number that had just called him. It was Feng Na's number. Feng Na, he thought to himself. Why is she looking for me? Could it be something that happened in the store? After Li Yundong dialed the number, he heard Feng Na sigh on the phone and say, "Boss Li, there's finally news from you. I thought you had already ascended to become a deity." Li Yundong chuckled. "What happened?" Feng Na could not help but say, "Hey, what are you talking about? Can't I look for you if there's nothing? You're really a hands-off shopkeeper. You don't care about this tea shop anymore? Shouldn't you at least show yourself?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "Isn't it because of you, Manager Feng? Is there a need for me to take care of it?" Feng Na sighed, "But you have to come today and you have to come right away." Li Yundong asked curiously, "What's wrong?" Feng Na said, "Chris's family is here. They are having tea in the tea house now." Li Yundong was shocked. "Huh? Her family is here? You found the tea house? What are you here for?" Feng Na's voice sounded a little helpless. "I'm here to look for Chris. I've already looked around the school but you wouldn't answer my calls. So I had no choice but to come here. I was shocked when I opened the shop this morning. Come quickly, I can't handle this matter." Li Yundong thought for a while and said, "Don't worry, you calm them down first. I'll call Chris first and ask Ziyuan to bring her back later. Then I'll go to the Desangxian tea shop and see what they say." After Li Yundong hung up the phone, he turned around and went into the room, telling Ziyuan about Chris. Ziyuan knew that Chris had contributed a lot to the auction of the Medicine King tripod, and her cultivation heart was quite devout. She also had a great opportunity. She was a good seedling that could only be cultivated. Although her family had come here to take her back, they still had to listen to Chris's opinion. They couldn't make decisions on their own. After Ziyuan picked him up, she immediately flew to Haikao. Ruan Hongling originally had a lot to say to Li Yundong, but seeing that he was busy rushing to the Desangxian, she had no choice but to swallow her words. After Li Yundong had explained everything, he hurried to the Desangxian. When he arrived at the intersection of the pedestrian street, Li Yundong saw Ching Ching, who had been looking forward to it, standing on her tiptoes and waving at Li Yundong. She hurriedly caught up with him and complained, "Hero Li, you're too mysterious. It's so hard to find you." Li Yundong looked at her with a smile and said, "What? You didn't make up an excuse to trick me, did you?" Ching Ching punched Li Yundong on the shoulder and said angrily, "What are you trying to trick? You're so heartless. We've been busy running this tea house these days. Is it easy? From purchasing goods to inspecting goods, from management to service, we're all naked. How could you say such sarcastic words? I'm so angry. Now I want to raise." Li Yundong laughed. Suddenly, his face turned serious and he said seriously, "Do you know what happened to Yao Jiesin?" Ching Ching was stunned and didn't react. She said angrily, "Hey you black-hearted capitalist, do you want to exploit and oppress us poor working people? Don't you know that asking for a raise is the normal right of working people?" Li Yundong said seriously, "I know, but it's a little miserable." Ching Ching looked at Li Yundong with her mouth agape and asked timidly, "How miserable? Will I be fired? You won't be so cruel, will you?" Li Yundong said with a smile, "No, the death penalty will be carried out immediately." Only then did Ching Ching react. She laughed and punched Li Yundong again. "You're so annoying. I didn't stab you 8 times. Li Yundong laughed and said, "Soon. Look at your resentful face. If you have a knife in your hand, do you think you can't stab me?" Ching Ching pursed her lips and smiled. "I wouldn't dare stab you. If I did, someone would fight me to the death. Besides, if I stabbed you, who would pay me?" Li Yundong laughed and bickered with Ching Ching. Suddenly, he felt as if he had returned to school. He felt a little emotional. As he walked, he asked, "By the way, how is the school now? No one wants to expel me, right?" Ching Ching said curiously, "Didn't you go through the procedures of suspension? Who would be so stupid as to expel the most famous student of Tianan University? Hey, you don't know, but you are now the role model of our school." Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. He thought to himself, role model? Learning how to fight and PK people all day long? Cheng Cheng saw that Li Yundong didn't believe her, so she explained anxiously, "You have to believe me. Now the student union is promoting you everywhere as a model for college students to start their own business. Your picture has been hanging on the publicity window of the school for more than a month." Li Yundong laughed. "Don't be ridiculous. Feng Na is no longer the president of the student union, is she? Yan Hua should have been promoted, right? He hates me very much. How could he do the publicity for me?" Cheng Cheng smiled proudly and said, "This is the last thing Nana did after she quit the student union. You really should have seen the expression on Yan Hua's face at that time. It was wonderful. I suspect that he wouldn't have that kind of expression even if he ate a raw mouse." Li Yundong smiled and talked with Cheng Cheng as they walked. Soon they arrived at the door of Desangxian. Li Yundong turned his head and saw that the door of Zhao's tea house was closed. General Tai was guarding the door. Obviously it was closed for business. He couldn't help but be stunned and asked curiously, "When did Zhao Yogan's shop close?" Cheng Cheng thought for a moment and said, "It seems to have been a while ago. I don't remember. It seems to have been a few days." What Li Yundong didn't know was that Zhao Yogan's soul had already left his body and he had died a long time ago. His property had almost been swept away by his two little sweethearts. When his family found that he was missing and his sweethearts had run away with his property, they immediately called the police. Zhao Yuzhen had been mean and selfish when he was alive. Once he died, his family naturally wouldn't be polite. In order to compete for his remaining property, they fought fiercely. All his real estate had been stopped for a long time and had entered the property evaluation stage. As one of his real estate, this tea house had naturally been closed long ago. Li Yundong thought for a while, but he couldn't figure out what was going on, so he didn't dwell on this issue. He smiled and said, "Well, one less competitor and the pressure will be less. How is business recently?" Just as Cheng Cheng was about to speak, she saw a man walking out of the door of Desangxian. He said unhurriedly, "Even if your tea house has no competitors, it will go out of business sooner or later." There was nothing more annoying than saying such unlucky words in front of a business shop. Li Yundong was secretly unhappy, but he didn't show it on his face. He turned his head and saw a man in a suit and leather shoes standing in front of him. The man was about 1.74 meters tall with black hair and an Asian face. He looked quite delicate, with a pair of gentle gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose. His hair was combed straight, and the leather shoes on his feet were shining like a mirror. The man stood on the steps and looked down at Li Yundong. Although his face was calm, his eyes were full of aristocratic superiority and contempt. Li Yundong thought for a moment and asked, "You are?" At this time Feng Na, who had been waiting at the door, rushed over and quickly introduced, "Li Yundong, this is Chris's." Before she could finish her words, another big man rushed out of the store. He was a typical American football quarterback. He was tall and burly with unkempt blonde hair, deep eyes and a high nose. The outline of his face was somewhat similar to Chris's. When the man saw Li Yundong, he immediately looked at Feng Na and Cheng Cheng. At this time, several little foxes on duty in the Desangxian store were also cheering and running toward Li Yundong. He immediately understood and shouted at Li Yundong with saliva flying everywhere. Li Yundong's English was very poor, and the man spoke very fast. How could he know what he was saying? He could only quietly avoid the man's saliva, then turned to Feng Na and said, "What did this guy say?" Feng Na looked at Li Yundong with some worry and whispered, "He said that he is Chris's brother. Just now he asked you why you kidnapped Chris to this poor and backward place. Did you seduce her? He wants to sue you to the local government and the court and—" No matter how good-tempered Li Yundong was, he couldn't help but frown and say in a deep voice, "And what?" Feng Na hesitated for a moment and didn't say anything. Instead, the young Asian man next to her sneered and said in non-standard Chinese, "Besides, your shabby tea shop looks like it's going to close down at any time. If you tell us Chris's whereabouts immediately and promise not to interfere in this matter, maybe we'll buy your tea shop and let you have a way out. What do you think?" At this time, Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. "What? Let me have a way out?" In Li Yundong's opinion, there was nothing more ridiculous than this. In the world, he was the only one who didn't want to give people a way out. Who would dare to say such words to him? Chapter 732. Americans and Chinese people did not understand each other's languages. Li Yundong's English was very poor, and this foreigner who claimed to be Chris's brother, also did not understand it. If the two of them talked to each other, they would really be like chickens talking to ducks, staring at each other. Soon, but in this world, in addition to language, laughter was interlinked. Whether it was a joyful laugh, a happy laugh, or a cold laugh, people could understand its meaning without translation. What was most unbearable and obvious was the laughter that was filled with mockery and ridicule. Although Chris's brother didn't know what the Asian man beside him had said to Li Yundong, Li Yundong's laughter really made him unhappy. His sister left a letter home and went to a distant country. It was reasonable to say that Westerners advocated independence and freedom, so they had no control over where his sister went. However, his sister had only left a copy of the letter for her grandmother. The others were completely in the dark. If they hadn't found out that they hadn't seen Chris for a long time and asked Lin Guiying, they wouldn't have known where Chris had gone. This matter made Chris's strict parents very angry. They couldn't imagine why such a good girl like Chris would put down her studies and go to a distant country like a psycho. Especially in the eyes of Chris's brother, since the last time Chris came back from China, she seemed to have become a different person. For God's sake, she had become like an Oriental wearing a Western skin. She kept mentioning Confucius, Mencius, and Zhuang to him. Damn it, do these ghosts who have been dead for more than 2,000 years have such great charm? When Chris's brother heard Li Yundong's laughter, he stared at him with a pair of bell-like eyes and shouted, "What are you laughing at? What's so funny? Where is Chris?" Li Yundong understood this sentence. He glanced at the quarterback in front of him faintly, turned his head, and said to the Asian man beside him who had spoken wildly, "Shouldn't you introduce yourselves first?" The Asian man pushed his glasses up and said in a reserved and arrogant manner, "My name is Han Zhen, Chris's fiancé. This is Chris's brother Jim." Compared to Crazy's brother Jim, the one who was even more upset was Han Zhen, who was standing next to him. Chris was a famous socialite at Pennsylvania State University. There was no one who didn't know her. It was impossible for a beautiful girl like her to have no suitors. Han Zhen in front of him was not only the one who pursued her the most fiercely, but his family and Crazy's family were also on good terms. When Crazy's family settled in Harrisburg, they once led the Chinese to fight against the local gangsters in the United States. The important allies of Crazy's family were this Asian man's grandfather's family. Almost there, after the two families gained a foothold, Chris's family slowly turned to light industry, while the Asian man's family chose to run a business in the underworld. However, Han Zhen's father had been involved in the underworld business for a long time, and he always felt that he would run into ghosts if he walked too much at night, so he always wanted to clear his name. As a result, he naturally turned his attention to Han Zhen's close family friend. The old man of the Han family urged his son to work hard to pursue Crazy. Even without his father's urging, Han Zhen was also an admirer of Crazy and had pursued her since a long time ago. But when he was pursuing her fiercely, he found that Crazy had suddenly disappeared. After Han Zhen used his power to find out where Crazy had gone, he suddenly flew into a rage. He firmly believed that this bastard named Li Yundong was competing with him for a woman, so he immediately wanted to rush to Tianan City to denounce him. But Han Zhen was a smart man. He knew that even if he came he would not be recognized and might be hated by Chris, so he dragged Jim along. Looking at Jim's figure, one could tell that he was a single-celled animal with 4 limbs and a simple mind. After being slightly urged by Han Zhen, he immediately rushed to Tianan City angrily. As the saying goes, a dragon has 9 sons and each son is different. Contrary to Crazy's low-key and reserved character, her brother was a typical Western playboy. He was domineering and arrogant. If it weren't for the fact that he was in the territory of his country, he would have beaten Li Yundong at first sight. Although Li Yundong's cultivation was only in the Yangshan phase for the time being, he was still a famous cultivator in the world. Naturally, he couldn't argue with these two ignorant guys. Otherwise, people might laugh at him for bullying the weak. Li Yundong glanced at the two of them and walked into the hall of the tea house. He said lightly, "Crazy will come over later. If you have anything to say, you can tell her. If she wants to go with you, I won't stop her." Logically speaking, these words were reasonable. However, when Han Zhen heard them, he did not feel good. Because he had sent Crazy a lot of text messages and made a lot of phone calls before. On the one hand, he wanted to find out where she was going, and on the other hand, he wanted to persuade her to come back. However, Crazy didn't reply to his text messages or answer his phone calls at all. Han Zhen was sure that Crazy was hiding from him. Going to the country was just an excuse. Maybe someone there had made her lose her mind for a while and made her fall in love with him. Especially when Han Zhen saw Li Yundong for the first time, he was even more shocked by his temperament. He came from a big family. Although he had seen many outstanding peers, He had never seen a young man as handsome and elegant as Li Yundong. Therefore, Han Jin immediately concluded that it was reasonable for Crazy to fall in love with this countryman in front of him. It was also because of this that even Han Jin himself didn't realize that in his subconscious, a demon called inferiority complex was gnawing at his soul and heart, making him more and more jealous of this countryman named Li Yundong. Han Jin was sure that even if Li Yundong asked Crazy to come, she wouldn't go back with them. Unless this countryman in front of him asked her to go back, Crazy would probably go with them obediently. Therefore, Han Jin stared at Li Yundong coldly and didn't take what he had said to heart at all. He just said, "You might as well think about what I said just now. If you are willing to persuade Crazy to go back with us, I can consider buying your tea house and paying twice the price. How about that?" Li Yundong didn't even think about it and immediately said flatly, "No." Han Jin didn't take it seriously. He sneered and followed behind him to look at the tea house. Although his voice was still calm, there was always a hint of sarcasm and contempt in his tone. He said, "Looking at the location of your tea house and according to the country's real estate and market policies, I can infer that your tea house should be rented. Therefore you are at best a rented and renovated shop. Looking at the effect of your renovation, it will cost you at most about 400,000 yuan. According to your other operating costs, your tea house is worth 700,000 yuan at most. I'll double it for you. 4 million yuan. Sell it to me and help me persuade Crazy to go back. How about that? 4 million yuan? The little foxes of the Fox Zen school looked at each other, and then one of them immediately said, "Wow, that's a lot of money. Will the leader sell it? If he sells it, he'll be rich." "Idiot, what will we eat if you sell it? How can you be so stupid as to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? You're so stupid." "That's right. However, our tea house has not been doing very well." "Idiot, shut up. Aren't you afraid that the leader will be angry?" At this time, Li Yundong was no longer angry. He quietly listened to Han Jin's chatter. He sat down at the tea table very calmly and smiled at the little foxes beside him. "What are you waiting for? Why don't you make me tea?" The little foxes seemed to wake up from a dream and went to make tea. Feng Na and Ching Ching stood to one side with worried faces. Li Yundong glanced at them and said with a smile, "Why are you standing there? Sit down, sit down." Feng Na and Ching Ching looked at each other, then secretly glanced at Han Zhen and Jim, who had ugly expressions on their faces. They then carefully sat down next to Li Yundong. Li Yundong asked with a smile, "How's the business of the tea house recently?" Feng Na hesitated for a moment as if thinking about how to phrase her words, but Han Jin sneered and said, "Do you still need to look at the business of your tea house? If it were a shop on the street it would be fine, but it is in the depths of the pedestrian street, and there is no good parking lot around. Why would anyone come here to drink tea? If you continue to run your tea house like this, it will go out of business sooner or later. Why don't you think about the offer I gave you?" Li Yundong turned his face and looked at him strangely. "How do you know that if my tea house continues to operate like this, it will go out of business sooner or later?" Han Jin sneered and said, "I've been waiting here for nearly 2 hours, but I haven't seen a single customer come in. Can your business be considered good? Besides, although China is the birthplace of tea culture, there are very few people who come to tea houses to drink tea. A tea house needs to do more catering business in order to survive, or it needs to have its own unique connections. Otherwise it will definitely not be able to survive." Han Jin looked Li Yundong up and down and said, "Looking at how young you are, I don't think you have any connections in the upper class, so it's only a matter of time before your tea house goes out of business." In all fairness, Li Yundong knew that Han Jin's words were very realistic. If he was really an ordinary college student, opening such a tea house here would definitely be courting death. It would be strange if the business did not suffer losses in outer space. But the problem was Li Yundong an ordinary college student? Hearing Han Jin's words, Li Yundong smiled slightly and didn't say anything more. He just looked Han Jin up and down and smiled without saying anything. Seeing Li Yundong's reaction, Han Jin was even more unhappy. He wanted to say something, but he saw that Li Yundong was ignoring him at all. What he had said just now was like playing the lute to a cow. Han Jin secretly gritted his teeth and suppressed his anger. He slowly sat down at the table opposite Li Yundong and said in a cold voice, "Miss, please pour some tea." The little foxes saw that this guy was very rude to their sect leader, so they didn't have any good expressions on their faces. A cute little fox held a teapot in front of him and snorted, "Pour it yourself." Han Jin was so angry that smoke was coming out of his 7 orifices, but he was also a shrewd person. He forcibly suppressed his anger and pulled Jim, who was about to make a fuss, to sit down and wait quietly to the side. After waiting for nearly 2 hours, it was almost noon. Li Yundong looked at the time and said to Cheng Cheng, "How do you solve your meals?" Cheng Cheng said, "Order takeout." Li Yundong nodded and said to Cheng Cheng with a smile, "Well, go out and buy it." Cheng Cheng answered and trotted out of the door. She was immediately delighted and said to Li Yundong, "Chris is here." Although Jim didn't understand, he could still understand the words Chris. He immediately stood up. Han Zhen was also delighted. He also stood up and wanted to go out to greet her, but when he moved, he saw that Li Yundong was calmly drinking tea beside him as if there was no one else around. He immediately stopped and slowly sat down again, as if he wanted to compete with Li Yundong in terms of bearing all the time. Jim didn't care so much. He quickly walked out and saw Chris rushing over. He didn't even have time to look at Ziyuan, who was next to him, and shouted at Chris. Chris was also a very assertive person. She raised her eyebrows and stood at the door of Desanxian, talking loudly with her brother in English. Ziyuan, who had followed them, glanced at them and entered the tea house. She glanced around and walked toward Li Yundong with a smile. At first, Han Zhen was still drinking tea calmly, but when he glanced around and saw Ziyuan, he was so shocked that he didn't even notice that the tea in the teacup had been poured on his body. He shouted crazily in his heart, "How could there be such a beautiful woman?" Especially when he saw this fairy who was like a fairy descending to the world, walking toward Li Yundong and smiling at him like a flower, a surge of jealousy almost burned him to ashes. What's so great about this guy? Not only did he win Chris's favor, but he also has such a fairy by his side. Ziyuan didn't know that Han Zhen was so jealous. She smiled and said to Li Yundong, "How is the tea house's business?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "It doesn't seem to be very good." Ziyuan smiled gently and comforted him, "It's okay. Business will get better. I saw that the tea house of Zhao across the street has closed, which means that we have one less competitor." Li Yundong chuckled. Before he could say anything, he suddenly saw Jim waving his arm, pointing at himself, and then the tea house roaring loudly. Li Yundong frowned secretly and asked Feng Na in a low voice, "What did they say?" Feng Na hesitated for a moment and said, "Jim said that our tea house is a joke and a pile of shit. If Chris doesn't go back with him, he will buy the tea house across the street along with this shit like Desanxian and let you have a taste of living on the streets and having nothing." Li Yundong didn't get angry. Instead, he laughed and said, "Nothing? Living on the streets? I've tasted it. I don't need his service. Tell him that not only will I not sell this tea house, but I will also open it all over the world in the future." As soon as he said this, not only was Feng Na tongue-tied, but her eyes were full of disbelief. Even the little foxes shook their heads secretly, not believing Li Yundong's words. Han Zhen was even more stimulated by Li Yundong's arrogant words and couldn't help laughing wildly, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. "Your broken tea house can open all over the world? I'm dying of laughter. If you can open it all over the world, I will be the President of the United States." Chapter 733. Han Zhen's words were so arrogant that Chris, who was at the door, looked at him. When Chris saw him, she frowned and walked in quickly, shouting, "Why are you here?" Although Han Zhen was shocked by Ziyuan's beauty, he was more interested in Chris's family background. If he could marry Chris, it would be a great benefit to his family. Because of this, Han Zhen immediately put away the arrogant smile on his face and returned to his usual gentle face. He smiled slightly and said to Chris in English, "Chris, why did you come here without saying hello?" Chris had been ignored by Li Yundong a few days ago. Although she had been very happy with Lu Feier and the others, she had been very tired. She had thought that she had come to China to learn cultivation, but she had accidentally ended up shooting a TV series. In particular, Li Yundong's words had made her rush from Haikou to Tianan City, more than 1,000 kilometers back and forth. Even a clay figurine would be a little angry if she were to be bossed around like this. However, Chris didn't dare to vent her anger on Li Yundong, so she vented all her anger on Han Zhen. Chris had never liked Han Zhen, who had a gangster background. After hearing his words, she frowned and said to him in Chinese, "Who are you to me? Why should I say hello to you? Do I need to tell you where I'm going?" This sentence almost made Han Zhen choke. He choked for a moment and a flash of anger flashed in his eyes, but he quickly recovered. He chuckled. Seeing that Chris was speaking to him in Chinese, he also said in Chinese, "Chris, I just care about you, especially your family. They care about you even more. Your brother Jim is concerned about your safety, so he specially invited me here to find you. Although Chris felt that she was being suppressed by Ziyuan and Zhou Qin in terms of beauty, temperament, and cunning, she was still a first-class woman in front of others. She glanced at her brother and immediately sneered, "Han, don't use my brother as a shield. Don't I know what kind of character he is? If you hadn't instigated him, would he have come here?" Han Zhen frowned and looked at Jim for help. Although Jim didn't know what they were talking about, he was not an idiot. Looking at their expressions, he knew that Chris had embarrassed Han Zhen. He immediately said, "Chris, why are you helping an outsider? Don't you know that father has already agreed to your engagement with Han?" Chris was so shocked that her eyes immediately widened. She subconsciously used her mother tongue and said, "What? Me? Han? Hal who agreed? Why am I the last person to know about my marriage?" The more Chris thought about it, the angrier she became. She furrowed her brows and glared at Han Zhen. "Are you the one behind this?" Han Zhen sighed and said to Chris with sincerity, "Chris, I really love you." As he spoke, he glanced at Li Yundong, who was drinking tea leisurely, and said with ulterior motives, "You're different from some people." Chris said angrily, "He's my master. Be more polite when you speak." Han Zhen frowned and glanced at Li Yundong disdainfully. "Master? What did you learn from him?" Chris was stunned when she heard this. After getting along with Li Yundong and other cultivators these days, she also found that cultivators like Li Yundong usually kept a low profile and didn't want others to know their true identities. She couldn't say in front of Han Zhen that she had come to China to learn cultivation, so she could only bite the bullet and say, "What I learn has nothing to do with you." Han Zhen was stabbed by her again, so he had no choice but to continue asking Jim for help. At this time Jim said, "Chris, our family misses you very much and so does Grandma. She asked me to find you and take you back. Do you have the heart to leave us in such an ignorant and backward place? Did this man use some magic to enchant your soul?" If Jim had been reasonable, he might have been able to persuade Chris, but he had mentioned Lin Guang. This made Chris instantly think of what Lin Guang had once said to her. Chris immediately understood that her grandmother would miss her, but when she had said that she wanted to come to China to be apprenticed to a master for cultivation, her grandmother had not only not stopped her, but had also greatly encouraged and praised her. Chris thought quickly and instantly concluded that Jim must have faked the imperial edict, using her feelings for Li Yundong to coax her to go back. She immediately sneered and said, "Jim, first of all, Grandma agreed that I came to China. Secondly, this is not an ignorant and backward place. On the contrary, it is a magical and charming country with a profound culture of 5,000 years. I like this culture, and it is the charm of this culture that has fascinated me." When Jim saw his sister talking back to him in public, he felt a little embarrassed. However, Chris was usually very doted on by her parents, and she was fair and modest. She had a lot of prestige in the family, and he listened to his sister's words in many things. He was angry, but he didn't dare to do it to Chris. He could only turn the gun and fire at Li Yundong. He shouted angrily, "Hey you yellow monkey, if you don't persuade Chris to go back, I'll break your bones." His words also scolded Han Zhen. The corners of Han Zhen's eyes twitched when he heard this, but he couldn't make a sound. Li Yundong saw that he was shouting at him in a stern voice. Obviously he was not saying anything nice. He took a sip of tea unhurriedly and said to Feng Na, "What is he talking about?" Feng Na was not willing to translate these words to Li Yundong. She had seen Li Yundong fight at school many times. She knew that if she translated these words, there would be a full-scale fight here. She was not worried that Li Yundong would be at a disadvantage in a fight. In her opinion, Li Yundong was a living immortal. She was only afraid that if someone rushed here with their underwear on, Li Yundong could also beat them until they wore their underwear inside out and rushed back dejectedly. But if they really fought, these two were foreigners. In China it would be a trivial matter if you beat a Chinese person, but if you beat a foreigner it would be a big trouble. If they investigated, it would alarm the foreign consulates. Feng Na's hesitation made Han Zhen, who was beside her, keenly aware of her timidity. He sneered and said to Li Yundong in Chinese, "I don't care if you are Chris's master or who you are. Anyway, you can't have anything to do with her anymore. Otherwise, I will definitely make you suffer." Li Yundong was amused. He held the teacup and drank the tea while looking up at him. He was like a lion lazily looking at a dog barking at him. "Oh, why do you want me to suffer the consequences?" Han Zhen gritted his teeth and was about to say something harsh when he saw Ching Ching suddenly rush in with 2 plastic bags filled with fast food. She shouted at Li Yundong from afar with a surprised face, Hey Li Yundong, there are a lot of Japanese people outside asking about you. What did you do? Did you blow up the Yasukuni shrine? Her words stunned everyone in the hall except Jim. The little foxes were naturally lively, so they hurriedly ran to the door and looked around. Sure enough, they saw many people holding colorful flags of tourist groups printed with Japanese characters walking along the street. One of them was bending down to ask passers-by about something. At this time he happened to raise his head and look at Desangxian. When the little foxes met his eyes, they immediately shrank their heads in fright and chattered to Li Yundong, "Leader, it's not good. The Japanese are here again." Li Yundong glared at them with a straight face and said in a deep voice, "What are you panicking about? I'm here." Seeing that he was sitting as still as a mountain, the little foxes were relieved and stayed obediently by his side. Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, said in a low voice, "Li Yundong, this is a busy city. You should control yourself and don't get into a conflict with them. If you really can't do it, let me do it." Li Yundong chuckled and said non-committally, "These guys don't keep their word. I just beat them away but they came back shamelessly. Hey, are they tired of living?" As the two of them spoke in low voices, Han Zhen and Jim looked at each other. They didn't know what was going on, so they had to sit aside patiently and wait to see what would happen. Li Yundong sat at the tea table in the middle of the hall, staring at the door with a sneer on his face. It seemed that he wanted to see which familiar face would appear in front of him in a while. The cultivation world of China and Japan was separated by a strip of water. Many Japanese cultivators were proficient in Chinese, and there were also many Chinese cultivators who were proficient in Japanese. Ziyuan didn't speak English, but she was proficient in Japanese. When she saw the flag, her expression suddenly became strange, as if she wanted to laugh. She quickly glanced at Li Yundong and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. She held back her laughter and wanted to see his reaction. When Li Yundong saw such a group of people, he was also stunned. He looked at the clothes of this group of people. It was really the style of the movie Men in Black. They were black from head to toe, and these people were all sturdy. Tattoos could be seen on the exposed skin of their clothes and necks, as if they were a group of gangsters traveling. Li Yundong's expression was strange, and he couldn't help looking at this group of people. This group of people also glanced at the plaque of the tea house in unison, and then at the shop in unison. One of them had a ferocious face, and at first glance, it was obvious that he was not a good person. He said loudly in strange Chinese, "Excuse me, is this Li Yundong's tea house?" Feng Na and Ching Ching, who were standing to one side, saw that this group of people did not seem to be good people at all. The murderous aura of this group of people was extremely strong, and it was the style of gangsters. The two of them were so scared that their faces turned pale. They thought that the gangsters had come to seek revenge. Feng Na involuntarily tugged at Li Yundong's sleeve and said nervously in a low voice, "Li Yundong, don't agree with him. Leave this to me. Hurry up and leave." Li Yundong looked at her and his heart skipped a beat. His eyes also softened a little. He chuckled and said, "Don't worry, these people are nothing to me." Although his voice was low, Han Zhen, who was next to him, heard it clearly. He immediately sneered disdainfully. Li Yundong ignored him and raised his voice to the Japanese people outside. "I am Li Yundong. What do you want?" The man who had spoken was suddenly stunned, and his eyes lit up. Are you Li Yundong?" Li Yundong stood up. Although there was a faint smile on his face, he was already secretly vigilant. As long as the other party had any evil intentions, he would immediately attack first. Li Yundong put his hands behind his back and said, "Yes, I am Li Yundong. What do you want?" The man in the lead immediately took 2 steps forward with an aggressive posture. The little foxes on the side were all shocked and subconsciously stopped in front of Li Yundong. But as soon as they moved, they saw this fierce-looking guy's momentum was like a rainbow, and his momentum was astonishing. He knelt down on the ground. The fierce-looking guy banged his head 3 times and shouted loudly in Japanese. Then the group of men in black behind him repeated this sentence and knelt down in unison. For a moment, a large number of people were kneeling in front of the Desangxian. For a moment, everyone inside and outside the Desangxian was stunned. Han Zhen and Jim, who had wanted to see Li Yundong make a fool of himself, almost dropped their jaws to the ground. The hall was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Li Yundong was also dumbfounded. What's going on? What's wrong with these Japanese people? Could it be that the battle at Mount Longhu had made them lose their minds? Chapter 734. For a moment, except for Ziyuan, everyone else in the Desangxian store was stunned. Even Li Yundong was dumbfounded and couldn't react for a while. After a while, he turned his head to look at Ziyuan with the corner of his eyes twitching. "You soon." But at a glance, he saw that Ziyuan was pursing her lips. The corners of her mouth were about to rise to the sky, and her eyebrows were also curved. Li Yundong immediately said in a low voice, "Hey, what the hell is going on? You are so unkind. Are you watching me make a fool of myself?" Ziyuan gently covered her mouth and whispered with a smile, "They are worshipping you." "Worshipping me?" Li Yundong felt as if he had heard the funniest thing in the world. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Why do these guys look like gangsters? Why are they worshipping me?" Ziyuan pursed her lips and whispered with a smile, "Isn't it because you are the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King?" Li Yundong's eyebrows twitched again. "I am the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King. What does it have to do with these guys?" Ziyuan explained with a low smile, "Although I can't see the origin of these people, I can see that they are carrying the banner of the Saki Corporation. As far as I know, the Saki Corporation should be a company group under the Saki Group of the Wakayama Prefecture branch of the Yamaguchi-gumi." As soon as Ziyuan said this, Li Yundong suddenly understood. The headquarters of Xinyan Tantrism, Mount Koya, was located in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. This place could be said to be the most powerful place of Xinyan Tantrism. Other sects in the cultivation world could not enter, and the local people naturally believed in the Buddha and the immovable Wisdom King. Since ancient times, in addition to the common people at the bottom, there were three special groups of people who believed in the gods the most. The first was the officials, the second was the businessmen, and the third was the underworld. Even in China, under the feudal rule of 2,000 years, no matter which dynasty or generation could escape this rule. Only after the establishment of the new country, the traditional survival of the cultivation world was almost swept away. The people at the bottom did not believe in the gods. The officials did not dare to believe in them openly because of their atheism, but in private, there were many people who donated and burned incense in order to accumulate some good karma. As for those who were businessmen and those who walked the underworld, they still believed in the same thing. Each of them was more devout than the other. In mainland China, it was still considered better, but in Hong Kong and Taiwan, it was more prevalent. If China was already like this, there was no need to mention Japan. In Japan, the forces of the cultivation world were unbelievably huge. Not only did they reach deep into the government, but they were also entangled with the underworld forces. They even colluded with each other and provided each other with supplies. The people in the underworld lived on the edge of a knife every day. Therefore they believed in the gods very much. When the leader of the Yamaguchi-gumi, the largest gang in Japan, passed away, they must invite an eminent monk to perform a ritual. Almost there, but this was only on the surface. In 2009, Shingen Tantrism had secretly accepted private donations and bribes from Yamaguchi-gumi. After this matter was exposed by reporters, it caused a sensation throughout the country. At that time, 10 abbot of Mount Koya resigned collectively due to the anger of the people. Although this matter was suppressed in the future, this matter was only the tip of the iceberg on the surface. From a glance, it could be seen that the collusion between the Japanese gangs and the Japanese cultivation world had been going on for a long time and was deeply rooted. A few days ago, the Japanese people formed a group to come to China to play dungeons. They came aggressively and returned dejectedly. Not only were they beaten to the point of losing levels, but even their equipment was almost destroyed by Li Yundong. After these Japanese cultivators returned home, they remembered that they had shouted before they went to kill the Chinese people and blow up all their equipment, and they felt ashamed. But after all, the defeat couldn't be covered up. Not to mention other things, Takahashi Shota of the Pure Land True Sect's Imperial Shadow Hall had been destroyed, and his account had been wiped out by Li Yundong. Even if his file had been deleted, the Tiantai sect was not much better. The leader of the sect had been killed by Li Yundong and deleted his account. Fortunately, his corpse had been snatched back. Finally, he was naked and did not have his equipment dropped by others. Xinyan Tantrism was not much better. Chang Sheng Vidra's fate was exactly the same as Takahashi Shota's. The three giants of Japanese Buddhism had been beaten miserably by Li Yundong, and the forces of Shintoism were not much better. They had been beaten by Li Yundong. Although they felt aggrieved when they went back, they really respected Li Yundong like a ghost. Li Yundong had insisted on fighting to the end, and he had indeed beaten these Japanese people until they were convinced. Moreover, under the encouragement of Ise Xingguang and the others, these pioneer groups of the Japanese cultivation world, who had been wiped out in the dungeon, had long unified their statements. They insisted that it was because the boss, the reincarnated Wisdom King, was too abnormal, not because their level was low and their equipment was incompetent. In this way it spread to 2 people, 3 people and countless people. For a time, the Japanese cultivation world knew that the Japanese cultivation world had been defeated by a reincarnated Wisdom King named Li Yunyang. Now, several major sects had given up and no longer mentioned going to China to play dungeons. Even if there were some who were not convinced, they could only complain in private. They knew that if they went to China to play dungeons, they were afraid that losing a level would be a light punishment. Originally, if a fight only led to losing experience in a level, it would be fine. If their accounts were wiped out by the boss and their accounts were banned, who could afford to be hurt? Who would play with them? However, there was no GM in the Japanese cultivation world. They wanted to complain to the upper echelons, but because of their face, they could only pinch their noses and bear it. However, the cultivation world swallowed their anger, but the underworld forces closely related to the cultivation world did not think so. No matter from which aspect, the Japanese Yamaguchi-gumi was the top 5 big bosses of the world's underworld forces, and this group of evil gangsters believed in Buddhism the most. Almost all of them even had Buddhist gods tattooed on their bodies. Among them, the 5 Wisdom Kings and Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva were the gods with the highest rate of tattoos. Yusun, the immovable Wisdom King, was the king of all Wisdom Kings and the king of all Wisdom Kings. He was very good at fighting and PK. Any Trailokai Vijaya, Junshali Wisdom King, Mahavira Wisdom King, or Vajrapani Wisdom King would be nothing in front of the immovable Wisdom King. Such a big boss, the great God King, if the underworld did not believe in it, who should they believe in? Could it be that they would believe in the smiling Maitreya Buddha? If it weren't for the strict requirements of the organization's tattoo pattern, and only the boss was qualified to tattoo the immovable Wisdom King on his body, I'm afraid that everyone in the Yamaguchi-gumi would have tattooed the immovable Wisdom King on his body. The main forces of the Yamaguchi-gumi were concentrated in the Kyoto and Osaka areas of Japan. The Binshi Temple of the Pure Land True Sect, the Yanli Temple of Mount Hai of the Tiantai Sect were in Kyoto, and the Kongabu Temple of Mount Koya of the Jinyin Tantrism was also near Osaka. It could be said that this place was a sensitive area where the forces of Jinyin Tantrism, Tiantai Sect and Pure Land True Sect intersected. When the news that Li Yunyang had defeated the 3 giants of Japanese Buddhism spread out, all the members of the Yamaguchi-gumi in Japan were shocked. Everyone was stunned and couldn't believe their ears. Immediately, there were people from the Yamaguchi-gumi who questioned this result. They couldn't believe that the 3 major Buddhist forces they believed in had been completely defeated by a Chinese man. But soon they found out that it was the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King who had defeated the 3 giants. How could this be? The Yamaguchi-gumi almost went berserk, and the crowd was in an uproar. Firstly, due to their identity and status, the bosses were still able to restrain themselves. Secondly, they were internationally known, so they were being watched wherever they went. Therefore, they were still able to sit calmly. However, even though they could sit still, their subordinates started to make a ruckus. What? The reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King is in the Chinese? Fuck, how did the immovable Wisdom King reincarnate to the Chinese? This is too disrespectful to our Japanese, isn't it? But, the Chinese Buddhism is the best in the world. If the immovable Wisdom King doesn't reincarnate there, where will he reincarnate? Besides, the river flows east for 30 years and the river flows west for 30 years. Who knows if he will be reincarnated here in the future? Forget it, Buddhism doesn't discriminate between races, and gods don't discriminate between national boundaries. The most important thing is to pay homage to the immovable Wisdom King. When I come back in the future, I can brag. I have seen the immovable Wisdom King. How cool will it be in the future? The Japanese people's feelings for their country were very complicated. They worshipped the past and suppressed the present. It could be said that they worshipped the ancient history of their country, but they also despised everything about their country in modern times. The immovable Wisdom King was also part of the ancient culture in the Japanese people's cognition. Over the years, many people had gone to the country to make a pilgrimage just to remember the dead Buddhist ancestors. At this time, they suddenly heard that a reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King was still in the world. How could it be? Understanding this, the believers of the Japanese Yamaguchi-gumi set off to Tianan City in a mighty manner. However, there were more than 38,000 members of the Japanese Yamaguchi-gumi. If all of them came to the country, then there would be no work to be done here. It would be enough to keep an eye on these Yamaguchi-gumi, who never meditated and only knew how to kill and set fires. Therefore, after a discussion, they decided to send Nishikyu Haruo, the sixth-generation leader of the Sasaki group in Wakayama Prefecture, to explore the way in Shina. Nishikyu Haruo was tall and strong with a fierce face. Even if he was wearing sunglasses, a scar could be seen from the corner of his eye to his neck, as if there was a red reptile crawling on his face and neck. The leader of the Sasaki group knelt on the ground, almost prostrating himself. His hands were pressed in front of him. One of his hands was missing 2 fingers. Obviously, he had violated the clan rules and had been cut off. The leader was usually very fierce, but at this time in front of Li Yundong he was as docile as a sheep. He knelt on the ground obediently and spoke Japanese. But after a while he saw that Li Yundong did not move, so he boldly looked up. At first glance, he saw that the young man was looking at him with flashing eyes and a strange expression on his face. Nishikyu Haruo's heart skipped a beat and he thought to himself, how could the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King be so young? It can't be fake, can it? Japan was a country that was very particular about the order of merit. Almost everything had to be done based on seniority and seniority. When there were elders around, young people could not speak easily. Sometimes, no matter how talented young people were and how reasonable their words were, no one in society would listen attentively to them. They would rather listen to the words of those older people. That was because in their subconscious, young people still needed to be tempered and needed to listen more. It was not the time for them to speak more. With such a mentality, Nishikyu Haruo began to doubt Li Yundong's identity. He asked tentatively in Japanese in a low voice, "Are you really, Your Excellency Li Yundong? The reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King?" Li Yundong naturally didn't understand this sentence, but looking at Nishikyu Haruo's expression, he could guess a little. He snorted coldly, raised his eyebrows, and looked at the large group of Japanese people kneeling outside. He said coldly, "What, you don't believe me? Do you want to have a try?" As soon as Ziyuan finished translating this sentence, Nishikyu Haruo boldly looked up at Li Yundong and was immediately shocked by his bearing and gaze. He was so scared that a layer of cold sweat broke out on his back. What a joke. The 3 giants of Buddhism had been beaten by this man and were now holding a funeral. How could he dare to compete with him? Besides, heroes come from the young. He had such a bearing at such a young age, and the women around him were unbelievably beautiful, especially the woman wearing a long white dress. She was so beautiful that she looked like a fairy that had walked out of a painting. He couldn't help but suspect something. Nishikyu Haruo quickly lowered his head. After thinking carefully, he mumbled a few more words in Japanese, and there were a lot of sounds in his voice. Ziyuan, who was next to him, translated it for Li Yundong. Li Yundong knew that Nishikyu Haruo was announcing his identity and expressing his respect and worship for the reincarnation of the immovable Wisdom King on behalf of the dozens of people in the Sasaki group. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry at these words. He thought to himself, the Japanese really don't know what's good for them. Lu Rinjiao, a famous general of the Tang dynasty, had wiped out the Japanese navy in one battle. Since then, the Japanese had been well behaved for nearly 1,000 years. Even if the Yuan dynasty had robbed the Han people of their beautiful country and destroyed the southern Song dynasty, the Japanese stubbornly believed that they were still vassal states of the Song dynasty and refused to recognize these barbarians of the Yuan dynasty as their boss. Now he was worried that the Japanese would come to make trouble. Now it seemed that it was a wise decision to insist on fighting to the end with injuries. Li Yundong's mind was racing, and he was thinking a little far away for a moment. However, Nishikyu Haruo saw that Li Yundong was hesitating again, and his expression was uncertain. He immediately handed over a golden invitation with both hands and said respectfully in stiff Chinese, "This is a small gift. Please accept it, Wisdom King." Li Yundong winked at Feng Na, who had been stunned for a long time. Only then did Feng Na timidly take the golden invitation. As soon as she opened it, she immediately sucked in a breath of cold air, and her heart was pounding. Although Feng Na came from a good family and had seen some of the world, she had never seen a scene like this before. She hadn't even seen it in the movies. With so many people in black kneeling here, even a fool would know who they were kneeling to. Although this idea had popped up in Feng Na's mind more than once, this time the impact and shock it gave Feng Na was especially strong this time. Feng Na looked at Li Yundong strangely and said in her heart, "Li Yundong, who on earth are you?" Feng Na's best friend, Ching Ching, saw that she immediately closed the golden invitation after glancing at it. She didn't dare to look at it again as if there was something scary inside. She curiously leaned over and opened it. Her eyes immediately widened and she covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes almost popping out of their sockets. Seeing the two of them like this, Li Yundong felt a little funny in his heart. They hadn't seen much of the world. He didn't know what they had seen to make them so shocked. But when he opened it himself, he was also shocked and his eyes widened. He looked at Nishikyu Haruo in front of him with his mouth agape and thought to himself, "Damn, this guy is so generous." Chapter 735. Li Yundong looked at the bank check in the gold card with a strange look in his eyes. There was an Arabic number 1 on it, followed by a series of OS, which made people really jealous and dazzled. Asterisk 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 as the saying goes, money moves people's hearts. Even a great cultivator like Li Yundong couldn't help but feel his heart beat faster when he suddenly saw such a long series of numbers. Dharma, wealth, companions and earthly treasures. Money was not omnipotent, but without money, it was absolutely impossible. He had just boasted that he would open Desanxian all over the world, and now someone had come to give him money. Even if he wanted to doze off, there was no need to give him a pillow like this, right? This was too strange. Although this series of zeros was the unit of measurement of Japanese yen, such a long series of numbers was scary even in Japanese. This Sasaki group is too rich. Why did they rush over to give me money? They have too much money to spend, so they want me to help them spend it? Although Li Yundong's face was still calm for a moment, he felt strange in his heart. He didn't know whether he should accept the money or not. Seeing his expression, Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, smiled and said in a low voice, "What's wrong? You don't dare to accept it? This is actually very normal. As far as I know, many rich businessmen and officials have gone to the temple to burn incense. They burn 600,000 merit incense every month. In this way you know how powerful it is." Li Yundong turned to look at her, smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "If it were you, would you dare to accept it?" Ziyuan thought for a moment, shook her head gently and said in a low voice, "This money is hot. I don't dare to accept it." Li Yundong also had a plan in an instant and secretly agreed with Ziyuan in his heart. If this money had been given by Shin Wankai or Chris, Li Yundong might have been thick-skinned enough to accept it. But who had given it? Yamaguchi Gumi. It was at least one of the top 5 underworld forces in the world. If he dared to accept this kind of money, his guts must be boundlessly plump. Even if he had 100 mouths to explain that he had nothing to do with Yamaguchi Gumi in the future, the higher-ups would not believe him no matter what he said. He had always kept a low profile. If he were to accept this money, he would really be afraid that the higher-ups would not look for him for tea and chat. He was tired of living. He wasn't afraid, but the problem was that because of this small amount of money, he would be targeted by the higher-ups from now on. That was definitely not worth it. As the saying goes, don't be afraid of a thief stealing, but be afraid of a thief remembering. If there was always a pair of eyes staring at you from behind, how could you live? Of course he could run away if he wanted to, but what about Su Chan? What about the Fox Zen School? What about Ziyuan? What about her Lingong sect? What about Feng Na and Qingqing? What about their families? Taking 10,000 steps back, even if he was bold enough to accept the money, what would the cultivators of the other sects think of him if word of this got out? Would someone use this as an excuse to poke him in the back and say that he was a traitor who colluded with outsiders? Although this matter was a little extreme, there had never been a lack of such patriotic people in China, especially when there was an economic dispute with Yamaguchi Gumi. It was really like mud falling in one's pants. Even if it was not shit, it was shit. Li Yundong didn't know that the Japanese underworld had always had a good tradition of donating to the forces of Buddhism. As long as it was not discovered, the disciples of Buddhism would always accept it with a smile. After thinking for a while, he pushed the golden invitation back and said very seriously, "I don't accept a reward without doing anything. Even if I am the reincarnation of Wisdom King, I can't accept this gift from you for no reason." Seeing that Li Yundong had refused him, but he couldn't understand what he had said, Nishikuharu was very anxious. He immediately turned his head and waved at a little brother behind him, who was black from head to toe. The little brother immediately got up from the ground and trotted over to him. After Nishikuharu asked him a few questions, the little brother quickly translated what Li Yundong had said before. Nishikuharu immediately said a few more words, and the little brother raised his head and said to Li Yundong, "The wise king, our team leader said that this is the incense money they donated. It's all very clean money, which represents our sincerity and sincerity. Moreover, the people who came this time are all members with clean identities. There won't be any disputes. Please accept it, the wise king." Li Yundong shook his head like a rattle drum. No, this is a tea house, not a temple. How can I accept incense money? I'll accept your kindness, but I can't accept this money. Nishikuharu saw that Li Yundong had refused so decisively, and he was very disappointed. For a moment, he couldn't help but lower his head with a depressed expression. However, the little brother next to him was a little clever. He whispered something to him, and Nishikuharu was immediately overjoyed. He gave him a look of appreciation, but the little brother looked as if he had eaten a ginseng fruit, and all his bones became lighter. Nishikuharu looked at Li Yundong eagerly and said, "The wise king, if you don't accept our donation, then at least, let us drink a few cups of tea and burn a few sticks of incense, right?" After listening to Ziyuan's translation, Li Yundong hesitated for a moment. Although he didn't like the Japanese people's behavior of flattering and bullying, as the saying went, one should not hit a smiling person. Nishikuharu in front of him should be considered a great figure in the local area. Now that he was carefully smiling at him, even if he was 100 times unwilling, he couldn't say it out loud. Li Yundong thought for a moment and thought to himself, it shouldn't be a big deal to come in and have a cup of tea, right? He has come from afar. Although he is a gangster, his heart is at least devout. I can't just close the door and go back and say that I'm not broad-minded, can I? Thinking of this, Li Yundong nodded gently, agreeing with Nishikuharu's words. He turned his head and whispered a few words to the little foxes beside him, asking them to prepare the tea set and boil the water to make tea to receive the guests. When the little foxes saw their sect leader being worshipped like a god, they felt an indescribable sense of pride. They turned their heads to look at Hanzhen and Jim, who had long been dumbstruck, and then hurried off to do their work. Hanzhen and Jim saw Nishikuharu waving his hand and saying a few words. The underlings who were kneeling at the entrance and blocking the pedestrian street all stood up and rushed into the Desangxian tea house. The tea house was filled to the brim with people. Even Nishikuharu himself did not have a seat to sit on. He could not help but glance at Hanzhen and Jim. He tried to speak to them in very awkward English. "Can I sit here and drink tea with you guys?" He thought that these two people were Li Yundong's friends, so he was very polite and didn't dare to offend them. After he finished speaking, Jim didn't mind, but Hanzhen's expression suddenly became very interesting. Jim's family was a righteous one, and he himself was a simple-minded playboy. He didn't have a deep understanding of the power of the Yamaguchi-gumi, but Hanzhen's family was in the underworld. How could he not know the famous Yamaguchi-gumi? Although his family was also in the underworld, compared with the Yamaguchi-gumi, those people in his family were really a group of good men and women who ate vegetarian and prayed to Buddha. They couldn't wait to ask Washington and the United Nations for a Peace Friendship Award to match their status. Although he was only the leader of the Sasaki group in Osaka, he didn't dare to offend him easily. If an ordinary person wanted to sit down with him at the same table, he might have kicked him out. But now that Nishikuharu wanted to sit down, how could he dare to stop him? Nishikuharu saw that he forced a smile and politely asked him to sit down, so he felt relieved and looked at Li Yundong again. Seeing that Li Yundong didn't want his donation, Nishikuharu was tempted to drink tea. "You don't want my money? Well, you're doing business anyway. I'll drink the most expensive tea. I'll order 10 cups in one go and pour 9 cups after 1 cup. You can't control me, can you? Now it's not considered a bribe, is it?" With this idea in mind, Nishikuharu waved his hand and asked his subordinates to relax a little. This time the subordinates suddenly cheered. Although most of them were rough people and didn't understand elegant things like tea art, this tea was extraordinary. This was tea made in the tea shop opened by the Akalanatha. Could an ordinary person drink it? Although it was not made by the Akalanatha himself, it was not ordinary tea. These subordinates all ordered the most expensive tea, and in an instant they ordered all the good Huangshan Maojian tea in the store. Ziyuan watched from the side as these uncouth men chewed peonies and commented on the quality of the tea. She didn't know whether to cry or laugh. At this time, Li Yundong also knew what the other party was up to. When he saw the little foxes running over to tell him that the good tea had been ordered by these guys and asking him what to do, he immediately had an idea and said in a low voice, "It's simple. Sell the rest of the tea to them at the highest price. If they want to give me money for free, I really don't dare to accept it, but if they want to take advantage of me and give me money for doing business, would I still refuse the money if I was out of my mind? Go, go, go. Anyway, these guys can't drink it." The little foxes were all overjoyed. One by one they laughed so hard that their noses and eyes couldn't be seen. When Feng Na, Ching Ching and Chris, who had rushed over, saw this scene, they were all speechless and smiled bitterly. Previously, when the members of the Sasaki group had knelt outside the pedestrian street, the surrounding tourists had seen a lot of Western scenery. Some people were very curious and looked at Desangxian. They didn't understand the origin of this shop and why it was like this. It seemed like a show. When one of the men passed by, he heard the people around him talking about it. His heart skipped a beat and he wanted to join in the fun and go in to drink some tea. However, a man who was walking with him tried to persuade him. "Old Zhang, don't go. This is a scam. I went there once before and I almost lost my pants. This shop is very black. Don't go there." The man who had spoken was none other than the man who had been tricked by Su Chan and the little fox in the Desangxian tea shop and almost knelt on the washboard. Today he happened to pass by here with his friends, only to see that there were many people watching the fun. They had wanted to go forward and watch the fun, but they hadn't expected that their companion would want to walk into the trap. In desperation he had to tell Lao Zhang what had happened. However, unexpectedly, his words aroused Lao Zhang's burning sense of justice. He said with a righteous face, "Are you kidding me? In this bright world, how could there be such a black shop in broad daylight? Is this still the world of the party? Are we still living under the red flag? I don't believe that they dare to trick me in front of so many people." As he spoke, he ignored the man's dissuasion, pushed through the crowd and swaggered toward Desangxian. Lao Zhang stepped into the Desangxian. Without even looking at it, he shouted, "I want to." Before he could finish his words, he suddenly saw that the Desangxian tea house was full of people. These people were all wearing black sunglasses, black suits, black trousers and black leather shoes. They were dressed as if they were afraid that others would not know that they were gangsters. Moreover, most of them were rough people. Some of them drank tea for a while and couldn't help but become unrestrained. As soon as they took off their clothes, they revealed dense and terrifying tattoos. It was really scary. It was also because Li Yundong was here that these gangsters did not dare to make a loud noise. They just whispered. For a moment, there was only a buzzing sound in the tea house. But when Lao Zhang roared, the buzzing sound suddenly stopped. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the man standing at the door. So many gangsters stopped talking at the same time. Their power was really scary. Lao Zhang's voice at the door was immediately stuck in his throat, as if he was a duck being grabbed by the neck. His back was covered with a layer of cold sweat. Without saying a word, he turned around and ran away. He rushed out of the Desangxian tea house and rushed to his friend. With a pale face he said, "You're right. This tea house is 2F** King evil. It's not an ordinary kind of evil. Let's go. We can't afford to offend them, but we can hide." After that, the two of them left as if they were fleeing. Li Yundong watched the man named Lao Zhang suddenly appear and then suddenly run away in fear. His heart suddenly moved and he couldn't help but complain. He wanted to cry but had no tears. It's over. Who dares to come here to drink tea in the future? In the eyes of others, my Desangxian tea house is probably a gangster tea house, right? Except for gangsters, no one will dare to come in the future, will they? Alas, one mistake can cause everlasting regret. I really shouldn't have been soft-hearted and let these Japanese people in to drink tea. Now, I was greedy for a small advantage, but I lost a lot in the end. Li Yundong was in pain, but Nishikuharu, who was beside him, suddenly said something to Li Yundong. As soon as he finished speaking, Ziyuan's expression suddenly became very interesting. Li Yundong asked curiously, "Ziyuan, what did he say?" Ziyuan smiled faintly and looked at Li Yundong with a strange look in her eyes. He said, "Are you interested in opening this tea house in Wakayama County?" Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Well, I was just wondering if Desangxian would become a professional gathering place for gangsters. You just said something like that. Do you really want to turn my tea house into a gangster chain tea house?" Chapter 736. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry at Nishikuharuo's words, but Hanjin was even more shocked. For God's sake, he had just made a bet with this guy, saying that if his tea house could be opened all over the world, he would be the President of the United States. As a result, someone from the Yamaguchi-gumi immediately ran over and cried, asking this guy to open the tea house in Japan. Although it was only Wakayama Prefecture, in Hanjin's opinion, if the Yamaguchi-gumi really helped him, it would be a matter of minutes to open the tea house all over Japan or even all of Southeast Asia. When the tea house opened to a certain number and accumulated a certain amount of funds and fame, it would definitely not be a joke to go global. Thinking of this, Hanjin's eyes kept turning, and his eyes were full of depression and doubt. The current situation was too coincidental. It was like a trap waiting for him. As soon as he jumped into it, the other party tightened the trap. You can't trick me like this. In Han Zhen's opinion, if he were to encounter such a thing, he would probably laugh so hard that he would wake up in his dreams. There was no need to hesitate, so he quickly agreed. However, Han Zhen was a gangster himself, so he regarded everyone else as gangsters. It was like some people were like maggots, but they regarded the whole world as a big manure tank. In Li Yundong's opinion, although Nishikuharu's proposal was a little tempting, and it was very timely, the identity of this guy was really inappropriate. If Li Yundong had any financial dealings with this group of guys, it would really be a stain that he would never be able to clear up in the future. Li Yundong thought for a moment and flatly refused Nishikuharu's proposal. Han Zhen, who was watching from the side, was shocked and anxious. He wanted to grab Li Yundong and scold him for being a fool. He would rather offend the Yamaguchi-gumi than seize such a good opportunity. However, Nishikuharu only revealed a disappointed expression and did not feel offended. Of course, if it had been an ordinary person in front of him, Nishikuharu would have immediately turned hostile and roared with a ferocious face, "Fuck, I gave you face but you don't want it. Someone drag him out and kill him." However, the person in front of him didn't dare to do so. He didn't even dare to think about it. In his opinion, it was normal for the reincarnated immovable wisdom king to reject him so coldly. However, he didn't dare to do anything except drink some tea during this trip, which made this senior Buddhist believer feel a little embarrassed. He was unwilling to go back like this, so he tentatively asked Li Yundong, "Please ask the wise king if I can burn incense here." After listening to Ziyuan's translation, Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He wanted to refuse, he wanted to laugh. He wanted to refuse, but Ziyuan winked at him as if she wanted him to help. Li Yundong had a deep trust in Ziyuan. His heart skipped a beat and he changed his words. "Okay, but I don't have any incense burners, merit incense or god statues here. Even if you want to offer incense, you don't have any conditions." Unexpectedly, after Nishikuharu heard the translation from his underling, he grinned and clapped his hands. Like magic, his underlings behind him conjured a wooden statue of the immovable wisdom king and an antique incense burner. Then these experienced mafias took out 3 joss sticks from their backs in unison. Although Li Yundong was also a great cultivator with great magical powers, he couldn't help but be a little stunned when he saw this scene. He thought to himself, "Oh my god, it seems that they are all ready. Amazing, truly amazing." He just didn't know whether these guys brought these from Japan or bought them locally. If it was brought over from Japan, wouldn't that be too exaggerated? However, even if it was bought locally, wasn't it a little too thorough? Was there a need to be so pious? Brother, are you part of the underworld or not? Why do you look more pious than those guys from Jinyan Tantrism? But these words were hidden in Li Yundong's heart, and he didn't ask them out loud. Although he also cultivated Buddhist mental cultivation methods, he didn't understand the fatality connection and the mind connection, so he could only hide these questions in the depths of his heart. At this time, everyone in the Desanxian tea house was stunned to see the group of black-clothed men respectfully place the statue of the immovable wisdom king on the tea table in the middle of the tea house hall, and then put an incense burner in front of the wooden statue. Nishikuharu took the lead in offering incense, and then the underlings behind him lined up in a long snake formation, quietly waiting to offer incense and pay their respects. Japanese people were rigid and law-abiding. Whether it was in society, in the company or at home, all kinds of rules were very strict. Among them, the rules of the underworld were even more astonishing and particularly cruel. These black-clothed men said that they would line up in 1 line, but they would never line up in 2. Moreover, none of them whispered to each other. Everyone lined up honestly according to their seniority. The line went all the way to the pedestrian street, blocking the intersection again. But when a passerby said that they were going to pass by, they didn't do anything to bully others. Instead, they honestly made way for them. When they passed by, they returned to the formation. Among them, there were those who had finished offering incense. They went to the side and stood with their hands crossed in front of them. Their eyes were focused on their noses were focused on their hearts, and their eyes were focused on their hearts. Li Yundong watched them take turns to offer incense with candles in their hands, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He turned his head and saw that Ziyuan was secretly laughing. He couldn't help glaring at her and whispering, "Hey, are you making fun of me?" Ziyuan smiled and was about to speak when she saw Ching Ching tugging at his sleeve and saying, "Hey Li Yundong, are they worshipping you?" Ching Ching was from an ordinary family. Looking at the scene in front of her, she felt like she was in a dream. She looked at the murderous black-clothed men taking turns to offer incense. She didn't dare to speak loudly and kept her voice low, as if she was afraid of alarming these gangsters. Li Yundong said with a wry smile, "It seems that they are worshipping me." At this time Feng Na also came to her senses a little. She was dumbfounded. She couldn't help looking at Li Yundong as if she had seen an Namekian. She covered her mouth and whispered, "No way, you're not dead yet." This sentence immediately made Ziyuan burst out laughing. The usually dignified and elegant fairy also found herself so indecent. For a moment she turned her head away, her shoulders shaking. The little foxes couldn't help but turn their heads and run to the warehouse at the back. As soon as they rushed in, they all burst out laughing. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "I'm not dead yet, but I think I'm about to die from their worship." Feng Na didn't think it was funny. She said, "They seem to be worshipping the immovable wisdom king? What does that have to do with you? Who the hell are you?" Li Yundong's face turned serious. "Actually, I am the legendary Martian. Earthlings, you should wake up." Feng Na was stunned and the corner of her mouth twitched. It seemed that she wanted to laugh, but in the end she didn't. Instead, she sighed sadly in her heart. "In the end he refused to tell me these things." However, Ching Ching, who was standing to one side, laughed heartlessly and said, "Hey Martian, be careful. Be careful, that Ultraman comes to make trouble for you." As she said this, she pointed to the Japanese who were burning incense. Li Yundong also glanced at them, only to see that although the Japanese had heard their whispers and laughter, none of them had turned their heads to look at them. They looked solemn and respectful, which really made people feel a little respectful. Li Yundong waved his hand at Feng Na and Ching Ching and said, "Forget it, don't make trouble. They are worshipping me and I, the master, am laughing on the side. It's not like a human being. It's really inappropriate, isn't it?" His words were serious, but when they thought about it, it was really strange and funny. Feng Na and Ching Ching both covered their mouths and laughed. At this time, more and more people gathered outside the Desanxian. Many people looked inside curiously, as if they didn't understand why this group of black-clothed people were burning incense and worshipping the gods here so devoutly and solemnly. For a moment they were all guessing and talking about it. Li Yundong saw that these Japanese people were burning incense in turn as if there was no one else around. He suddenly said to Ziyuan in a low voice with some embarrassment, "Hey, in the future will my Desanxian become the hall of these guys? Isn't this too exaggerated?" Ziyuan pursed her lips and smiled, but didn't answer his question. Instead, she turned to Feng Na and Ching Ching and whispered, "How much was the turnover just now?" Ching Ching immediately ran to the counter and took a look. Her eyes suddenly widened. She trotted over and said in a slightly trembling voice, 1,380,000. Feng Na suddenly sucked in a breath of cold air. She knew that this group of Yamaguchi-kun must have earned a lot from this tea, but she didn't expect that they would give away so much money. Li Yundong was also speechless for a moment. When he had opened this tea shop, he had aimed at high-level people, but he hadn't expected that it would be such a high-end method. This was really a case of not opening for 3 months but opening for 3 years. Of course, this was also due to Li Yundong's ruthlessness just now. Whether it was bad tea or bad tea, he had sold it to these guys at a sky-high price. Otherwise, these people wouldn't have been able to drink so much money even if they broke their stomachs. After all, Feng Na and Ching Ching had not seen much of the world. Suddenly seeing so much money, their mouths were dry, their eyes were hot, their hearts were beating fast and their voices were trembling. They were even more flustered. Ever since Feng Na had resigned from the position of president of the student union of the school, she had wanted to help Li Yundong take care of the tea shop, so she had put almost all her effort into it. Although she was surprised, she soon thought of something and whispered to Li Yundong, "Li Yundong, this money, can you accept it?" As she spoke, she looked at these gangsters worriedly as if saying, "These guys are not good people at first glance. Will they go back on their word?" At this time, Li Yundong laughed and said, "Don't worry, they won't go back on their word." Feng Na was relieved. She looked at the Japanese people who were taking turns to offer incense and said in a low voice, "Li Yundong, why didn't you agree to open a tea house with them just now? Do you think their background is not good?" Li Yundong glanced at the Japanese people in the hall and said with a wry smile, "Do you want Desanxian to become the Zhonghua branch of Yamaguchi-gumi or the Tonko branch of Tianan City in the future?" Feng Na couldn't help laughing. She said in a low voice, "It doesn't matter if they don't cooperate, but I have a good way to make a lot of money." Chapter 737. When Li Yundong heard Feng Na's words, he immediately laughed. Although his cultivation was high now, he was not very interested in fame and fortune. However, at the moment, a large group of people were living with him. He had to let them live a good life with him. Otherwise, they would have to live a hard life in the future. No matter how good he was at fighting, it would be useless. Soon. It wouldn't have mattered if he was alone, but every woman around him was a great beauty. Even Ching Ching was a pretty big girl, not to mention the others. With such a group of enchanting beauties following him, not to mention jewelry, clothing, food, housing and transportation, he had to keep up with them. Otherwise, when beauties like Su Chan, Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin went out, what they were wearing were street stalls. What would that be like? Even if they were willing to wear them, he couldn't bear to look at them. Therefore, even if Li Yundong had enemies all over the world, he had no hatred for the word money. Li Yundong asked with a smile, "What, do you have a good idea?" Feng Na chuckled, quietly pointed at Nishikuharu and said in a low voice, "It's very simple. The wool comes from the sheep." Li Yundong was stunned for a moment. He understood a little but he couldn't believe it. He stared at her in disbelief and said, "You mean?" Feng Na smiled and said, "I know you are a gentleman and are embarrassed to say such things, so don't listen to my idea. I'll tell Zi Yuan." As she said this, she turned her head and whispered a few words to Zi Yuan. However, with Li Yundong's cultivation, how could he not hear what she said? When he heard it, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Feng Na whispered to Zi Yuan to tell the Japanese to leave the wooden statue and the incense burner here and not take them away. Although these words seemed to have no head or tail, the meaning behind them was very memorable. The other party had brought an incense burner and a wooden statue, but they wouldn't let anyone take them away. What did they mean? It was very simple. They could keep it for future use. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It seemed that Feng Na was ready to do business with him again. Feng Na's idea was simple. It was nothing more than using Li Yundong as a shield. Logically speaking, this idea of hers was a little whimsical, so she didn't go into detail about it. It was clear that this fresh graduate was quite a scheming person, especially at a time like this. His quick-wittedness and quick reflexes were commendable. Given time, he might even become a capable person in the business world. Feng Na's idea was very simple, and it was obvious that Li Yundong's idea was rather whimsical. Soon. After Feng Na finished speaking to Zi Yuan, she looked at her with sparkling eyes. In the depths of Feng Na's heart, she had long been envious and in awe of Zi Yuan. When she first saw her, she was completely overwhelmed by this woman. No matter how she compared herself, she couldn't find any way to surpass her. This really made Feng Na discouraged. In Feng Na's opinion, compared to Zhou Qin and Su Chan, she also had her own strengths. However, in front of Zi Yuan, she felt that the other party was unfathomable and unfathomable. She didn't dare to show the slightest bit of disrespect. Therefore, Feng Na secretly looked at Zi Yuan anxiously, for fear that she would frown and say something bad. After hearing this, Zi Yuan looked at Feng Na in surprise, and then smiled at Li Yundong. "You found a good manager." Feng Na was overjoyed, and her heart that had jumped to her throat immediately calmed down. Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, "You too. Forget it, I don't care. You guys do what you want." Ching Ching, who was standing to one side, spoke up for her best friend. "Hey Li Yundong, that's not very kind of you. We help you take care of this shop. We do all the purchasing and accounting. We're so tired that we don't even have time to sleep at night. It's fine if you just leave everything to us, but how can you say such sarcastic words? You can't be like this." Feng Na was very anxious when she heard this. She quickly pulled Ching Ching aside and whispered, "Hey, stop talking." However, Li Yundong's expression changed. He pretended to bow with his hands in front of his chest and said, "You two great talents, I'm sorry for being impolite." His behavior immediately made Feng Na and Ching Ching laugh. Ching Ching smiled and said, "Well, I thought that now that you have become a big shot, you don't care about us small people anymore." Feng Na glanced at Ching Ching and said in a low voice, "You really measure the heart of a gentleman with your own mean measure. Li Yundong is not such a person." As she spoke, she glanced at Li Yundong. Suddenly, she felt that the hothead who had shattered a boulder on his chest back at school was gone. The one standing before her was a mature, yet ridiculously young man. He was looking at her with a smile. Although she still couldn't figure out who he was, the background and power that he had displayed made her tremble in awe. But the more she thought about it, the more precious Li Yundong's unpretentious and easygoing attitude became. This was especially so when she saw this mesmerizing boy in front of her. When he smiled, it was as if there was a layer of light around him that made people unable to look at him directly. If they looked at him for too long, their hearts would beat wildly. For a moment, Feng Na's heart skipped a beat. She could no longer associate this man with the boy she had met at school. Feng Na was dazed for a moment. Cheng Cheng coughed dryly, which brought Feng Na back to her senses. Her cheeks turned crimson, and she hurriedly lowered her head to hide her embarrassment and shyness by tucking her ears behind her ear. Li Yundong noticed that this senior of his, who used to have a sense of chivalry and shrewdness, was now acting like a pretty girl from a humble family. Her shyness when she lowered her head added a touch of charm to the round-faced beauty. Ching Ching, who was standing to one side, saw all of this. She raised her eyebrows and looked at Feng Na playfully. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something that would make Feng Na want to tear her mouth apart. Fortunately, before she could say anything, Li Yundong laughed and said, "Feng Na, Ching Ching, you two can do whatever you want. Since this shop is handed over to you, you can do whatever you want. I trust you. At the end of the year, I will reward you according to your contributions." As Li Yundong spoke, he casually patted Feng Na's shoulder. Although this action was nothing special in the eyes of others, Feng Na's heart suddenly skipped a beat. She felt as if her shoulder had become a little numb and soft. Ziyuan, who was standing to one side, sighed in her heart when she saw Feng Na's lustful look. She shook her head and said, "It's really a pity that Yundong is always like this. What will happen to this guy in the future? How many girls will he hurt?" However, Ziyuan also knew that she was also in a mess, so she didn't have the leisure to care about others. She quickly restrained her thoughts and said to Li Yundong, they've finished burning incense and are waiting for you." Li Yundong turned his head and took a look. Sure enough, he saw Nishi Kuharu and the others standing respectfully in the hall, as orderly as soldiers waiting for their officers to inspect them. Li Yundong nodded to Ziyuan and motioned for her to follow him. Ziyuan smiled slightly, indicating that she understood, and followed him. Nishi Kuharu had seen Li Yundong, Ziyuan, Feng Na, and the others laughing and talking about something. He also knew his identity, so he didn't go up to join in the fun. He waited obediently for Li Yundong. If Li Yundong said that he would wait for a few hours, he would probably wait here for a few hours. Although the leader of the Sasaki group was not a devil who could stop children from crying in Wakayama County, he was definitely a cruel and merciless person who killed people without blinking an eye. Except for his own boss, he was only so respectful in front of Li Yundong. If it were his enemies, they would probably not believe that the famous Nishi Kuharu in Wakayama County would be as docile as a kitten. When Nishi Kuharu saw Li Yundong coming up, he quickly took 2 steps forward and said a few words. Ziyuan told Li Yundong that the Japanese wanted to pay the bill, but they expected that it would cost a lot of money. They didn't have so much cash on them, and the checks in their hands couldn't be broken to pay the bill, so they wanted to ask someone to go with them to the bank. Li Yundong nodded and glanced at Feng Na and Ching Ching, asking them with his eyes which one of them was going to go. Ching Ching raised her hand without thinking and said, I'll go. Immediately, a little fox jumped up and raised her hand, joining in the fun. Feng Na was amused and annoyed at the same time. She tugged at her and said in a low voice, Hey, these are all gangsters. Do you dare to go? Ching Ching smiled and said, I didn't dare before, but now don't you see who is standing behind me? He is a big shot who makes these gangsters kneel down and kowtow to him. Don't worry, I'm not afraid. With that, she casually stepped forward and curiously looked at the scar on Nishikuharu's face and the tattoo on his neck with a pair of black eyes. Nishikuharu looked at her and grinned, trying to get close to her. However, as he smiled, his face became more and more ferocious, which scared Ching Ching so much that she couldn't help but take a step back. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the little foxes who had volunteered to join in the fun and asked one of them to go with Cheng Cheng. Although they were not powerful in the cultivation world, they were more than enough to deal with these Yamaguchi-kun. The little fox that had been chosen was overjoyed. She immediately put on an arrogant look and followed Nishikura Haruo and the others out in a line. The black-clothed members of Yamaguchi-gumi finally left, and the shop of Desanxian suddenly became brighter, but the upstairs and downstairs were a mess. Li Yundong gestured to the other little foxes in a low voice, motioning for them to clean up. At this time, Chris, who had been silent all this time, came up and whispered, Master, are you really going to open the shop in Japan? Li Yundong looked at her strangely and said, Didn't I already refuse these Japanese? Chris hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, I mean, if you invest in Japan, maybe I can help. If you want to open a tea shop in the United States, I have a way. Li Yundong looked at Chris in surprise. Before he could speak, his eyes involuntarily swept over Han Zhen and Jim, who were not far away. Han Zhen had naturally heard what Chris had said, especially what had happened just now, which made him feel as if he had been slapped in the face twice. Although Li Yundong hadn't said a word of humiliation to him, he felt his face burning. He wanted to find a hole to hide in immediately. Jim, on the other hand, didn't have such thoughts. His idea was very simple. He was a hedonistic son of rich parents, so he naturally looked down on those commoners. However, if the other party also displayed powerful strength and background, then he naturally wouldn't be so stupid as to bare his teeth at the other party. No matter how retarded hedonistic sons of rich parents were, their family background and starting point were still much higher than that of ordinary people. As long as they used their brains a little, they would be able to think and see much more than ordinary people. At this time, in Jim's opinion, this dark-headed and yellow-skinned countryman didn't look as eye-catching as before, but he still felt a little uncomfortable. In particular, Chris's tough attitude made him feel even more embarrassed. Han Zhen kicked Jim gently, motioning for him to speak. Jim said to Chris, "Chris, are you really not going back?" Chris hesitated for a moment, glanced at Li Yundong, and then shook her head decisively. "No, I'm already an adult. Jim, you go back. Say hello to Mom and Dad and Grandma for me." Jim muttered a few words. He wanted to bulge his eyes and yell at Li Yundong, "King, look after my sister. If anything happens to her, I'll break your bones. Or my eyes are on you. Don't act recklessly." But the previous scene had really frightened him, a playboy. He couldn't say such words that had been easy to say in the past. He hesitated, but Han Zhen, who was beside him, simply pulled him away with a dark expression. The two of them walked far away before they slowed down their pace. Jim looked dejected and muttered, "T, we came here for nothing." Han Zhen glanced at him contemptuously, but when he looked up at him, he smiled again. He pushed the gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose, smiled slightly and said, "It doesn't matter. Let's go back first. After we go back, I have a way to get Chris back." Jim turned his head to look at him. "Do you really have a way?" Han Zhen turned his head to look in the direction of Desangxian, and a trace of haze flashed across the corner of his eyes. He smiled coldly and said, "Let's wait and see." Chapter 738. After Nishikyu Haruo and the others left, Li Yundong waited in the Desangxian tea shop for a while. While discussing the future management of the tea shop with Feng Na, he waited for Ching Cheng and the accompanying little fox. When Ching Cheng and the others came back, Li Yundong saw her smiling face with her eyes narrowed into a line, so he felt relieved. He turned to Feng Na and said with a smile, "I'll leave this place to you in the future. I'll come here often." After saying goodbye to Feng Na, Ching Cheng, and the little foxes on duty in the shop, Li Yundong walked out of the Desangxian with Ziyuan and Chris. Walking on the street, Li Yundong looked at Chris, who had her head lowered, and suddenly asked softly, "Chris, do you really not want to go back?" Chris looked up at Li Yundong with resentment in her eyes, but this emotion only lasted for a moment. Soon, she calmed down and said to Li Yundong, "Master, are you really not going to consider driving the Desangxian to the United States?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "Let's put this matter aside for now. I appreciate your kindness. By the way, how long will it take for the crew to finish shooting?" Chris thought for a moment and said softly, "It should be more than 10 days. Li Yundong asked curiously, "So soon?" Chris couldn't help but look at Li Yundong with a complaining look. She was very unhappy that Li Yundong had left her alone in the crew. She said in a low voice, "Although I'm the second female lead, I don't have many scenes. The people in the crew take good care of me, so the shooting progress is very fast." Li Yundong knew what Chris was feeling. He smiled slightly and said, "That's good. In a while it will be the spring festival. At that time the crew should be on holiday. You should come back quickly at that time. We'll have a New Year's Eve dinner together." Chris suddenly raised her head and looked at Li Yundong with a twinkle in her eyes. As a China expert among Americans, she naturally knew what the Spring Festival and the New Year's Eve dinner meant to the Chinese people. If they hadn't regarded her as a close person, they probably wouldn't have invited her. However, Li Yundong didn't seem to notice her strange gaze and said, "You are alone outside and you don't want to go back. You will definitely be very lonely during the new year. Anyway, you are my nominal disciple now. It will be good for you to come over and have some fun with us." Chris felt slightly relieved and whispered in her heart with some disappointment, "So that's how it is?" Chris nodded silently and followed behind him. This foreign girl, who was now in a state of confusion, had no idea what kind of amazing achievements she would have in the future. At this time she felt like she was sandwiched between two pieces of bread. If it weren't for her stubborn character and the faith that John and her grandmother had given her, she would have given up on this cultivation trip in China. Li Yundong glanced at Chris and said, "By the way, how much did you deal with Chow Kefi and the crew?" Chris restrained her thoughts. She thought about it carefully and said, "Not much, but President Chow is very kind to me." Li Yundong nodded and asked, "Does she usually do anything strange?" Chris looked at Li Yundong in confusion and asked, "Strange behavior?" Ziyuan, who had been silent all this time, suddenly glanced at Li Yundong with flickering eyes, but she quickly withdrew her gaze and quietly listened to the conversation between the two of them. Li Yundong didn't notice Ziyuan's gaze. He still looked at Chris seriously and said, "Well, for example, some abnormal behavior in her personality? Or don't you feel that she sometimes doesn't act like herself?" Chris's gaze became more and more strange. She thought for a moment and said, "No, but President Chow has rarely shown up in recent days. She often stays in her room alone and doesn't come out. Sometimes even Lu Feier can't see her." Li Yundong frowned slightly and nodded secretly. He laughed and said, "Then are you going to rest in Tiannan City for 2 days or are you going back?" Chris ran her fingers through her long blonde hair and pursed her lips. Although her eyes were full of fatigue, her face showed her determination and stubbornness. She said softly, "I'd better go back first. The crew is waiting for me to film." Li Yundong turned to look at Ziyuan and said, "Ziyuan, will you see her off?" Without waiting for Ziyuan to speak, Chris shook her head and said, "No, I'll go back by myself." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Did you bring your passport? Do you have money on you?" Chris nodded and said, "I brought everything. Don't worry about me." Li Yundong asked in confusion, "Isn't it much faster to ask Ziyuan to send you back?" Chris looked at Ziyuan, then shook her head firmly and refused. "No, I'll take the next flight back by myself. You don't need to send me back." As she said this, she quickly ran out and stopped a taxi on the street. She waved to Li Yundong and Ziyuan and then quickly left. Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan and shook his head. This girl has a strong self-esteem. Does she not like the feeling of flying at high altitude? Ziyuan smiled slightly and said, "She doesn't like the feeling of being pulled in the air by others. She wants to fly with her own strength." Li Yundong sighed softly. What a stubborn girl. Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong and asked, "If you still don't want to accept her as your disciple, then let her go back quickly. Don't delay others." Li Yundong shook his head. "It's not that I don't want to accept her as my disciple, but I haven't observed her well enough. Although I have seen some sects accept many foreigners as disciples these days, I always feel that something is wrong. Although I have never come into contact with these foreigners, I don't know why they cultivate. But I always feel that they are only chasing after a mysterious power, not out of yearning for the profound culture of our Chinese nation." Ziyuan smiled slightly. "So you still want to observe her for a while? Why do I feel that you want to do an experiment on her?" Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan in surprise. This idea was in his subconscious and he didn't even notice it. But when Ziyuan pointed it out, his heart suddenly became clear. Li Yundong couldn't help but praise, "My parents gave birth to me and Ziyuan knows me well." "You're right. I've been thinking that if I accept her as my disciple, with her talent and intelligence, and the fact that she has absorbed the divine aura of Elixir, she will definitely have great achievements in the future. If she falls in love with the Tao, that's fine. But if one day, I'm gone and she betrays her sect, what should I do? Or perhaps, the Tao technique that she learned was accidentally spread out one day and learned by bad people. What should we do then?" Ziyuan accompanied Li Yundong as they walked slowly side by side on the bustling street. One of them had an elegant temperament and a beautiful appearance, while the other was elegant, tall and slender. They were really a golden boy and a jade girl, attracting countless people to keep looking back. But the two of them acted as if there was no one else around, whispering and concentrating. After listening to Li Yundong's words, Ziyuan said in a low voice, "You think too much. As long as you accept a disciple there must be risks. According to what you said, Jinren Zhang Jishuan should not be able to sleep every day." Li Yundong sighed helplessly. When the Shantian sect came to Mount Longhu, there were so many foreigners inside, especially the 3 formation eyes of the Shantian formation. Two of them were actually foreigners, which really made me feel a lot. Kong said so many things on the mountain, but I agree with one thing. Courtesy is lost in the wild. Up until now, the traditional culture of China is being lost and lost every day. Although the cultivation world is slowly recovering now, you can see that the leaders of Xingyi school, Chuanzhen sect, and other sects are all focused on cultivation and are unwilling to get involved in worldly affairs. The other people in charge are focused on fighting for power and profit. Only a few people want to promote the cultivation method. The most important thing is that the government does not support these things, so the people can't understand them. In particular, the lack of traditional culture has led to the lack of cultivation soil, so the way of cultivation naturally can't be developed. It's useless to just rely on us here to advocate and wave the flag. Ziyuan glanced at Li Yundong and said softly, "Haven't you ever thought about going abroad?" Li Yundong shook his head. Although foreign countries are more free and relaxed, the cultivation soil is thinner. Moreover, my roots are here and I won't leave. Ziyuan smiled. So you want to experiment on Chris? Li Yundong nodded gently. I want to see if she can perfectly realize my idealized goal. Ziyuan asked tentatively, let her cultivate out of love for our China's traditional culture, rather than out of yearning for mysterious power? Li Yundong smiled bitterly. Does this sound a little difficult? It seems that I began to be interested in cultivation because of this mysterious power. But after all, she is different. She is a Westerner. Ziyuan sighed softly and said, yes, after all, people who are not of our race must have different hearts. Your worry is also reasonable. If it were just ordinary foreigners, it would be fine. They may not necessarily have high achievements, but Chris is different. If she suddenly betrays us in the future, the consequences will be too serious and terrible. Li Yundong nodded and said, well, only when Chris has a strong sense of identity and even a sense of belonging to our China culture will she never have a rebellious heart. Ziyuan laughed. After saying so much, it's actually just one sentence. You want to assimilate her. Li Yundong also laughed. When Western culture invades on a large scale, why can't we assimilate a Westerner? Look at the history of China. During the chaos of the 5 barbarians, our Han people were killed and became a minority, but in the end they were all assimilated by us. During the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, ethnic minorities invaded and were also assimilated by us. During the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols occupied the central plains, and during the Qing dynasty the Manchus entered the country, but in the end they couldn't escape the fate of being assimilated by us. As he said this, Li Yundong turned his head and looked at Ziyuan with flickering eyes. Why can't we assimilate these Westerners? Instead, we want them to assimilate us in turn? Ziyuan nodded and said seriously, I know what you mean, but Li Yundong, since you have such great ambitions, you have to understand that if you want to do these things, you and your current Fox Zen school will never be able to do it. You have to start your own sect. Li Yundong pondered for a while. Start a sect? Ziyuan said, that's right. If you do these things as the leader of the Fox Zen school, no one will approve of what you have done. No matter how much you do in the future, when people talk about you in the future, they will just say, meddling in other people's business, and comment on you. Only after you establish your own sect and use Desanxian as a medium can you spread your ideas and beliefs to every corner of the world. In this way, everything you do will be recognized, and you will be remembered by history and future generations. Li Yundong was silent for a long time before he raised his head and sighed. The views of the secular world are really deep-rooted. I see. Let's talk about this later. Let's go back first. The two of them talked along the way and walked home for a long time. As soon as they entered the house, they saw that the living room was full of people, all of them looking anxious and nervous. Li Yundong was stunned. What happened? When Su Chan, who was in the living room, saw Li Yundong, she immediately rushed over like a gust of wind and hugged him. Her eyes were full of tears. She cried, Yundong master is missing? Li Yundong was shocked. What? Ao Wushuang is missing? Where did she go? Chapter 739. At this time, Su Chan was already in a panic. She sobbed and said, I don't know. I was just too tired to stay by her side. I slept for a while and when I woke up, master was gone. Li Yundong's face darkened and he frowned, but he comforted her by saying, don't cry. It's not your fault. If your master wants to leave, I can't stop him. But, where could she have gone? Then Li Yundong was shocked and looked at Su Chan in horror. Your master didn't go to find Wang Yuanshan, did he? Su Chan raised her head with tears in her eyes. Sherboy and I thought the same, but we didn't dare to go, so we've been waiting for you to come back. Li Yundong took a deep breath. He knew that if Ao Wushuang went to find Wang Yuanshan, she would definitely make a scene in Mount Longhu, and her ending would definitely not be good. Li Yundong's expression changed and he said in a low voice, "Don't worry, I'll go to Mount Longhu now." Ziyuan hurriedly said, "No, you can't go." Li Yundong gave her a strange look and asked, "Why?" Li Yundong, Ao Wushuang may not necessarily go to Mount Longhu, and all of us can go, but you can't appear for this matter. Ziyuan was a little embarrassed. Li Yundong was stunned and didn't understand, but he soon realized something after thinking about it. If Ao Wushuang really goes to Mount Longhu to make trouble, the leader, will be in big trouble. Should I stand up for her or not? If he stood up for her, wouldn't he be going against Wang Yuanshan? If he fought with him, what would happen to Ziyuan? If he didn't stand up for her, how was he going to explain himself to Su Chan? Li Yundong sighed helplessly. He originally wanted to let Ziyuan go, but he was afraid that she would be in a difficult position. After thinking for a while, Li Yundong looked up at Zhou Qin, who was looking at him worriedly not far away, and said, "Zhou Qin, can you go? Be polite. If Ao Wushuang is not here, you can come back. If she is here, you can try to mediate. How about that? The Jingyi school also owes me a favor. If you go, it will be easier for both sides to step down." Zhou Qin nodded without hesitation. "Okay, I'll go." With that, she didn't delay any longer and flashed out of the door. After watching her leave, Li Yundong said softly to Su Chan, "Don't worry. Your master is an experienced and prudent person. Unlike you, she won't do anything stupid." However, even Li Yundong himself didn't believe what he had just said. In his opinion, with Ao Wushuang's temperament, she definitely couldn't accept the fact that Wang Yuanshan had betrayed her. If she didn't do something extreme, it would be strange for her to be aggressive. It was just that Li Yundong hadn't expected it to happen so soon. In his arms, Su Chan raised her head. Although she knew that he was comforting her, she did feel much better. She nodded gently and said in a choked voice, "I know. I won't do anything stupid." Li Yundong smiled and said, "All right, don't stand here. You're crying like a kitten. Go wash your face and wait for Zhou Qin's news later." Su Chan nodded and walked to the bathroom while wiping her tears. Ziyuan, who was beside him, pulled Li Yundong's arm and glanced at his room. She said in a low voice, "Li Yundong, I want to have a word with you." Li Yundong nodded and followed her into the room. He asked, "What's the matter?" Ziyuan said in a low voice, "I saw you ask Chris about Chow Kefi before. Do you have any ideas?" Li Yundong sighed softly and said, "Yes. I want to help Chow Kefi keep her divine sense and memory." Ziyuan was shocked. "You want to snatch her body from the mystical silver fox?" Li Yundong frowned slightly. "I know that the mystical silver fox is very difficult to deal with, but her strength must not have recovered yet, so Chow Kefi's memory and divine sense are still alive. But I'm afraid that with the passage of time, the power of the mystical silver fox will become stronger and stronger, and Chow Kefi's memory and divine sense will slowly become chaotic, thin, and finally disappear completely. At that time, Chow Kefi will no longer be Chow Kefi, but the real mystical silver fox." Ziyuan couldn't help smiling bitterly. "But do you know how difficult it is to keep Chow Kefi's divine sense and memory?" Li Yundong sighed and said, "Of course I know. This is the mystical silver fox, a devil who has turned China and Japan upside down. It can even be said that before the Tang dynasty, the nine-tailed fox was a divine beast worshipped by the world, but after her, the nine-tailed fox became synonymous with disaster and disaster. However, do I give up saving my friend just because the opponent is very strong and abnormal?" Ziyuan fell silent. After a while, she said softly, "I only know two ways." Li Yundong was overjoyed. "I knew you had a way. Tell me quickly." Ziyuan thought for a moment and said, "The first way is to completely destroy the soul of the mystical silver fox and kill her in Chow Kefi's body." Li Yundong immediately smiled bitterly. "You'd better tell me the next way. This way is definitely not going to work. This is something that neither the Chinese cultivation world nor the Japanese cultivation world has been able to do. The cultivation of the mystical silver fox has reached the peak of the golden immortal realm. Her soul can't be erased, it can only be sealed. If we want to kill her soul by force, we can only ask the ninth heaven divine night thunder to strike down and then attack with the magic formation. Will the mystical silver fox stupidly drill into the magic formation? Even if she is willing, a bolt of divine thunder will strike down. Before the magic formation can work, Chao Kefi will have already turned into nothingness. Ziyuan also said helplessly, I also know that this method won't work, but it's also a way. The second way is. Ziyuan gently bit her lip, looking like she wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Li Yundong rarely saw her like this. He couldn't help asking curiously, what's wrong? Is there anything you can't say? Ziyuan hesitated for a moment and said softly, the second way is to use a special magic weapon to seal her first, and then use another kind of magic weapon to separate the divine sense and memories of Chao Kefi and the mystical silver fox. Li Yundong was overjoyed. Is there such a magic weapon? What kind of magic weapon is it? Ziyuan sighed softly, shook her head and didn't speak for a while. Li Yundong couldn't help saying, what kind of magic weapons are they? Is it inconvenient to say? At this time a person suddenly rushed in from the door. It was Ruan Hongling who had been staring at Li Yundong and Ziyuan since they entered the door. The girl had been eavesdropping at the door for a long time. At this time she finally couldn't help rushing in and shouting, it's the azure glass mirror and the purple gold luo jade plate. Li Yundong didn't react for a moment. Ah, these two magic weapons? Where are they? The names of these two magic weapons sound so familiar. Aren't they the two magic weapons you once gave me to pass through the heavenly tribulation? Ziyuan glared at Ruan Hongling fiercely, nodded silently and didn't say anything. Li Yundong looked at Ruan Hongling and Ziyuan with a smile and said, I haven't seen you use them since the last time you went through the heavenly tribulation. Now they come in handy again. There's no time to lose. These two magic weapons should be with you, right? Shall we go now? Ruan Hongling said anxiously, Shiji, do you still want to hide it from me now? Li Yundong finally noticed that something was wrong. He looked at Ruan Hongling doubtfully and then at Ziyuan. You too. Ziyuan sighed faintly and took out the purple gold luo jade plate and the azure glass mirror from her sleeve. Li Yundong looked at them and was shocked. Why are they all broken? Why are they cracked like this? Li Yundong looked up at Ziyuan and his heart suddenly skipped a beat. He cried out involuntarily, could it be that they were damaged when you helped me pass through the heavenly tribulation? Ruan Hongling said loudly, did you just find out? Do you know how much my Shiji has sacrificed for you? These are the powerful magical weapons of our Lingong sect. It was because they were destroyed in Shiji's hands that she was almost punished by the sect rules during the succession ceremony. Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan in shock. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Ziyuan glared at Ruan Hongling angrily, but when she looked at Li Yundong she pretended to be calm and said calmly, it's nothing. It's just a small matter. Li Yundong couldn't help but say angrily, is this a small matter? What kind of person do you think I am? As he said this, he strode forward and snatched the two powerful magical weapons from Ziyuan's hands. He said angrily, I've told you everything. Why are you still hiding something from me? When Ziyuan saw him scolding her, although there was a helpless smile on her face, she felt warm in her heart. She said softly, I just don't want to cause you any trouble. Li Yundong glared at her and said, you're the one who's causing me trouble. As he said this he turned his head to look at Ruan Hongling. Do you know if these two things can be repaired? Ruan Hongling turned a blind eye to Ziyuan's threatening gaze and quickly said, of course I know. Li Yundong asked, tell me quickly. Ziyuan is unreliable. I don't believe her. Tell me I believe you. Ruan Hongling was very proud of herself. She made a face at Ziyuan and then proudly shook her head and said, you want to know? Li Yundong said seriously, of course. Ruan Hongling pointed at Ziyuan and said, ask my Shiji. Li Yundong pretended to be angry and said, I already said that I don't believe her. But before he could finish speaking Ruan Hongling made a face at him again and said, but only Shiji knows. Li Yundong said angrily, hey, are you kidding me? You just said that you knew. Ruan Hongling chuckled and said, I know that Shiji knows. Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard this, and Ziyuan couldn't help but burst into laughter. Li Yundong turned his head helplessly and said to Ziyuan in a drawling voice, Ziyuan. Leniency for those who confess, severity for those who resist. You know our party's policy. Ziyuan shook her head helplessly and said with a faint smile, I'm really afraid of you. You have to get involved in this matter. Li Yundong said unhappily, what do you mean? Could it be that after you've done so much for me, you're not happy that I'm doing something for you? What kind of person do you think I am? Even passers-by don't treat me like an outsider, do they? What kind of person do I think you are? Ziyuan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment her heart raced. Her eyes flashed and she lowered her head. After a long time, she looked up and said with a chuckle, I only know that there is a sect in the cultivation world that is good at repairing powerful magical weapons. But that was a rumor more than 200 years ago and I heard it from my master. I don't know if it's true now. Li Yundong quickly asked, which sect? Chapter 740. Ziyuan looked at him and said with a slight smile, it's the Penglai sect. Li Yundong asked curiously, Penglai sect? Isn't he from a small sect? Ziyuan nodded slightly. It is indeed a small sect, but it was also a famous sect during the Tang and Song dynasties. However, during the Yuan, Ming and Qing dynasties with the rise of Jingyi school and Xuanzhen school, it slowly declined. Li Yunyang thought for a moment and said, I remember that when the 6 great sects besieged Mount Tianlong, we met the Penglai sect. Later we also met them on Mount Gazao. Ziyuan said, yes, during the inauguration ceremony, there were also people from the Penglai sect on the stage. I remember that this person from the Penglai sect seems to be called Yu Manlu. My master once told me that the secret of the Penglai sect is repairing powerful magical weapons, but I don't know if the current leader, Yu Qing, has passed down this secret skill. Li Yundong hesitated for a moment before saying decisively, then let's not delay any longer. Shall we go now? Ziyuan advised softly, aren't you waiting for Zhou Qin? Let's wait for her to come back. Even if the Penglai sect can repair the transcendent artifact, it won't be possible in a short time. Ruan Hongling suddenly said, Shiji Ziyuan, I want to go too. Take me with you. Ziyuan glared at her. What are you going to do? Cultivate well at home. Ruan Hongling immediately became unhappy. Are you afraid that I'll be the third wheel? These words made Ziyuan blush, and she glared at Ruan Hongling as if she wanted to eat someone. However, Ruan Hongling seemed to be used to this kind of gaze. She made a face at Ziyuan, then waved her fist at Li Yundong and said, hey, take care of my Shiji or else, humph? Li Yundong didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he watched her turn around and walk out of the door. The ponytail behind her head swayed, full of youthful aura. After Ruan Hongling left, there was a moment of awkwardness in the room. Ziyuan lowered her head and said in a low voice, I'll go out and see if Ruan Hongling is back. As she spoke, she moved lightly out of the room. Li Yundong knew that Ziyuan had just left, so how could she come back so soon? Ziyuan was deceiving herself and hiding from him. But what else could he do if he didn't hide? Li Yundong sighed softly and sat down in the room. After waiting for more than 2 hours, Zhou Qin came back. The woman, who had traveled more than 3,000 miles back and forth, looked a little travel-worn, but she didn't even have time to take a sip of water before she hurriedly said to Li Yunyang, who was coming out to welcome her, Master, I didn't see anything in Mount Longhu. It seems that Ao Wushuang didn't go. Su Chan was shocked and anxious. Master didn't go? Where did Master go? Li Yundong waved at the little girl. When she leaned against him, he held her in his arms and comforted her softly, don't worry. Since your master didn't go to Mount Longhu first, it means that she hasn't gone to the extreme path. Things won't be too bad. Maybe she just wants to be alone and doesn't want us to disturb her. Su Chan also agreed with him. She calmed down a little and looked at him eagerly. But when can I see Master again? Li Yundong patted the little girl's head and said softly, cultivate well. When you become very, very strong, then you can go to Mount Longhu and force Wang Yuanshan to explain clearly why he abandoned your master. Okay. In Li Yundong's opinion, the best way to comfort the little girl was to set an unreachable goal for her. Then this goal would drive her to temporarily forget her worries and sadness and then turn all her attention to cultivation. At first, he had endured the separation from the little girl and the pain of lovesickness. He had focused all his attention on cultivation, which had made him progress by leaps and bounds. After hearing Li Yundong's words, Su Chan's eyes lit up. She nodded hard, her beautiful lips pressed tightly, and there was a firm and decisive look on her face. Li Yundong smiled in his heart. Although Ao Wushuang was missing, it was a blessing in disguise. Who knew if this would become an opportunity for Su Chan to explode? Li Yundong gently stroked the little girl's soft black hair and turned to Zhou Qin. Zhou Qin, I'm going to Penglai with Ziyuan. Please take care of the family. Zhou Qin asked curiously, Master, what are you going to Penglai for? Li Yundong looked at Chao Yi, Lu Yuehong and the others who were also looking at him and explained, I'm going to the Penglai sect to see if I can repair Ziyuan's Tongtian glass mirror and Zijin Luoyu plate. The Penglai sect? Before Zhou Qin could speak, Chao Yi suddenly said in surprise, Leader, why do you suddenly want to repair these two powerful magical weapons? Li Yundong looked at Ziyuan and said, don't you know that Ziyuan was almost arrested and put in prison by the Jingyi school because she damaged these two powerful magical weapons? If the Japanese hadn't come, I'm afraid I would have had to fight with the Jingyi school. Moreover, in order to help me get through the heavenly tribulation, Ziyuan destroyed these two powerful magical weapons. I have to help her repair them, right? Besides Chao. Before Li Yundong could finish his words, Ziyuan suddenly said, Li Yundong, let's take Su Chan to Penglai later. Li Yundong was stunned. Before he could speak, Su Chan grabbed his sleeve and said firmly in a low voice, Yundong, I want to go with you. Li Yundong glanced at Ziyuan and thought to himself, is it because you want to avoid arousing suspicion that you took Su Chan with you? Ziyuan, you're really tired of living. Since Ziyuan had made such a gesture and Su Chan had made a firm request, Li Yundong didn't say anything more. He gently patted Su Chan on the shoulder, smiled at her, and motioned for her to go to Penglai with him. Then Li Yundong nodded to Zhou Qin and then to Chao Yi. Finally, he said a few words to the little foxes at home and took Ziyuan and Su Chan out. After Li Yundong went out of the door, Lu Yuehong looked at the backs of Li Yundong and the others and couldn't help sighing faintly. Leader is really... Why is he so busy? It seems that he doesn't go home all day long. Chao Yi glanced at Li Yundong's room, covered her mouth and chuckled. Leader has always been here. Lu Yuehong came to her senses and said with a smile, he's here but his soul isn't. After chatting and laughing for a while, they returned to their respective rooms. But what no one knew was that after Chao Yi returned to her room, she quickly wrote a small note and put it in the body of a small paper crane. Then she walked to the balcony and looked around. With a spread of her palm, the small paper crane flapped its wings and flew up with a whoosh. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the horizon. The paper crane flew all the way in the direction of Dongwu City. No one would have noticed such a small paper crane flying in the air. It passed through the bustling streets and came to the bustling Shantang town of Dongwu City. Then, it flew over the heads of the crowd and finally came to a secluded pavilion. It folded its wings and quietly landed beside a mahogany windowsill with an open window. As soon as the paper crane landed, a strong and powerful hand stretched out. It was Lu Yi. Lu Yi picked up the paper crane and took off the note in it. After glancing at it for a moment, he clenched the paper ball tightly and frowned. He stood by the windowsill like a stone statue, motionless. A middle-aged man's voice came from behind him. He chuckled and said, What's wrong? Is there any bad news? The person who spoke was Wang Jinyuan, who had disappeared for a long time. At this time, the master of the Gizao sect, who had cut his wrist in the Battle of Tiandu Peak, had achieved a transformation in his cultivation. He had smoothly entered the Jinshin phase from the Yangshin phase and had even cultivated to the intermediate level of the Jinshin. At this time, the aura all over his body had changed from being released to being restrained. He looked no different from an ordinary middle-aged man, but his face had a strong foreign aura and a pair of bright eyes, which made him particularly eye-catching. Lu Yi didn't turn his head and asked in a deep voice, Do you know Yu Qing of the Penglai sect? Wang Jinyuan said curiously, I do. What's wrong? Lu Yi turned around and asked with flickering eyes, Does she know how to repair powerful magical weapons? Wang Jinyuan laughed and said, I think so. But how do you know? Only a few cultivators know this news. I went to Penglai with my master a long time ago and saw him looking for Yu Qing's master to repair powerful magical weapons. At that time Yu Qing was still a little girl, so she accompanied him. Now more than 30 years have passed. I think she should have inherited this unique skill, right? Lu Yi narrowed his eyes slightly. He put his hands behind his back and paced back and forth in the room. After a while, he suddenly raised his head and said in a deep voice, I'm going to Penglai. Can you introduce Yu Qing to me? Wang Jinyuan stroked his beard proudly and said, Of course I can help you. But why do you want to see Yu Qing? Do you have any powerful magical weapons to repair? Lu Yi stopped and said, Me? No, I'm not going to find her to repair powerful magical weapons. Wang Jinyuan asked curiously, Then what are you going to do? The corners of Lu Ye's mouth curled up slightly, and a cold smile appeared on his face. I'm going to kill her. Wang Jinyuan took a deep breath. What? You have no grudge against her. Why do you want to kill her? Lu Yi turned his head and stared at Wang Jinyun coldly. Others may not know, but I know it best. If Yu Qing repairs the glass mirror of heaven and the purple gold Luoyu plate, the mystical silver fox will be in trouble. I can't sit back and watch someone threaten the growth of the mystical silver fox. Before the second day of February comes, I will help her clear away any obstacles and troubles in front of her. Are you going? Wang Jinyun frowned slightly. But you don't have to be so cruel. There was a hint of cruelty and ferocity in Lu Ye's eyes. He snorted coldly and said, "How do I know if she is willing to cooperate with me? In my opinion, the dead are the most reliable." Wang Jinyun sighed and shook his head. I always thought that I was ruthless enough. It turns out that compared with you, I am simply a kind man. I have a good personal relationship with Yu Qing. I can't do this. At most, I won't help you inform her. You can go by yourself. There was a flash of contempt in Lu Ye's eyes, but he quickly restrained his gaze and said in a deep voice, "Well, help me do another thing." As he spoke, he said a few words to Wang Jinyun in a low voice. After that, he stared at Wang Jinyun and said, "Do you understand? Well, I'll go first." Wang Jinyun watched Lu Yi walk out of the room unhurriedly. He looked at the back of the old fox with a complicated look in his eyes and shook his head. He sighed in his heart. "Old thing, have you finally found that Li Jiandong has gotten out of your control? Are you flustered? Are you nervous? Hey, don't worry. You should be busy with the plan first. I will give you an unexpected surprise." Wang Jinyun thought silently in his heart. The corners of his mouth curled into a slight smile, and his eyes were full of complacency. I'm very uncomfortable. There's still one more night to go. I won't come out today. I'll make up for it tomorrow. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.